Amidst the thunder of cannons and the quiet scratch of ink on decrees, one man rose from obscurity to bend the fate of a continent. Born on a small Mediterranean island at the edge of empires, Napoleon Bonaparte did not inherit a throne, a crown, or an ancient lineage. He inherited a revolution, unfinished, chaotic, and hungry for order. Europe, at the end of the 18th century, was a continent in convulsion. Monarchies trembled, borders bled, and old certainties collapsed beneath the weight of new ideas: liberty, equality, nationhood. Into this storm stepped a young artillery officer with an unmatched memory, relentless ambition, and an instinctive understanding of power. Napoleon did not merely fight wars. He reorganized states, rewrote laws, and reshaped how modern nations would govern, conscript, and dream. Yet his story is not one of simple conquest. It is a paradox carved in blood and brilliance. He crowned himself emperor in the name of the people. He spread revolutionary ideals at the point of a bayonet. He built institutions that endure to this day and led millions to their deaths in pursuit of glory and security. This is not the tale of a hero or a villain alone. It is the complete historical journey of a man who rose faster than history had ever allowed and fell with equal force. To understand Napoleon Bonaparte is to understand modern Europe itself, its laws, its wars, its ambitions, and its limits. In the dawn of an age trembling on the edge of revolution, the island of Corsica lay suspended between empires, identities, and unfinished wars. The year was 1769. Only months earlier, Corsica, long defiant of foreign rule, had been forced into submission by France after years of resistance against Genoese control. Its hills still carried the echoes of rebellion, its villages the memory of bloodshed, and its people a quiet bitterness toward the distant power that now claimed them. It was here, in the coastal town of Ajaccio, that Napoleon Bonaparte was born, into a land conquered, unsettled, and unresolved. Corsica was not merely a birthplace, it was a condition. Its rugged terrain bred endurance, its politics bred resentment, its culture, fiercely independent, resisted assimilation even as French authority tightened its grip. For a child born into this fractured moment, identity was never simple. Napoleon would grow up speaking Italian-inflected dialects, surrounded by Corsican customs, yet legally French by decree. From his earliest days, he belonged fully to neither world. The Bonaparte family traced its lineage to minor Tuscan nobility, titles inherited, but wealth long faded. Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, was ambitious and politically adaptable, aligning himself with French authorities after Corsica's defeat. This decision secured limited privileges and educational opportunities for his children, but it also placed the family in a delicate position among fellow Corsicans, many of whom viewed cooperation as betrayal. Letizia Ramolino, Napoleon's mother, embodied resilience and severity. Hardened by years of conflict and scarcity, she raised her children with discipline, frugality, and emotional restraint. From her, Napoleon absorbed an early lesson. Survival required control of resources, of emotion, of circumstance. Napoleon was the second of 8 surviving children, growing up in a household marked by constant financial strain. The family's noble status granted little comfort. Their home echoed with ambition but lacked stability. From an early age, Napoleon displayed an intense inward temperament. He was not charismatic, not socially graceful, and not indulgent in childhood play. Instead, he observed, withdrew, and remembered. He read obsessively. He nursed slights silently. The world, to him, was something to be understood before it could be mastered. At the age of 9, Napoleon left Corsica for mainland France, a journey that would permanently fracture his sense of belonging. Sent first to a religious school in Autun to learn French, he arrived speaking it poorly, his accent marking him instantly as an outsider. From there, he entered the military academy at Brienne-le-Château. The environment was cold, socially and physically. Isolated among wealthier classmates of established French nobility, Napoleon faced mockery, exclusion, and loneliness. His Corsican heritage, foreign speech, and threadbare uniforms made him an object of derision. Yet it was within this isolation that his inner discipline hardened. Napoleon did not seek acceptance. He sought mastery. While others pursued leisure, he buried himself in study, especially mathematics and history. Artillery science fascinated him. Unlike cavalry or infantry, artillery rewarded precision, calculation, and intellect over lineage and flair. It was the perfect domain for a boy without social capital, but with relentless focus. Numbers made sense. Trajectories obeyed logic. Guns responded to knowledge, not pedigree. At Brienne, and later at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, Napoleon consumed the writings of Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu. From them, he absorbed ideas that would shape his worldview: merit over birth, rational order over inherited chaos, the state as an engineered system rather than a divine inheritance. These were not abstract philosophies to him. They were tools, answers to the humiliation of his youth and the disorder he saw in both Corsica and France. Paris exposed him to another reality: the widening gulf between privilege and competence. While aristocratic cadets relied on family connections, Napoleon advanced through performance. In 1785, at just 16 years old, he graduated as a second lieutenant of artillery, one of the youngest in his class. His father had died the same year, leaving the family in deeper financial distress. Responsibility fell on Napoleon's shoulders early. He sent money home. He calculated expenses meticulously. Even as a teenager, he lived with the seriousness of a man twice his age. But beneath his discipline simmered resentment toward the aristocracy that dismissed him, toward France that had conquered his homeland, toward a world structured by inheritance rather than ability. These tensions did not weaken him, they sharpened him. Napoleon was learning not only how to command guns, but how to endure neglect, absorb pressure, and convert grievance into ambition. By the time he emerged from military school, Europe stood unknowingly on the brink of transformation. The Ancien Regime still ruled France, but cracks were forming beneath its gilded surface, and within the ranks of its army stood a young Corsican officer, quiet, disciplined, and intensely observant, waiting for history to create an opening. The island had shaped him. Exile had hardened him. Education had armed him. The aged had not yet noticed Napoleon Bonaparte, but the conditions that would elevate him were already assembling, slowly, silently, and inevitably. In the years following his commissioning, Napoleon Bonaparte entered a France that still appeared stable on the surface, yet beneath it stirred forces that would soon tear the kingdom apart. The army into which he was absorbed was rigid, aristocratic, and slow to reward talent. Advancement depended less on merit than on lineage. For a young Corsican officer with no powerful patrons, progress was limited, and frustration grew steadily. Napoleon spent long stretches stationed in provincial garrisons, Auxonne, Valence, towns far from Parisian glamour, where routine drills and bureaucratic stagnation defined military life. Yet these years were anything but idle. Napoleon used isolation as a forge. He read incessantly classical histories of Rome and Carthage, biographies of Alexander and Caesar, treatises on law and government. He wrote essays and political pamphlets, some fiercely Corsican in sentiment, revealing lingering loyalty to his island's struggle against French domination. At this stage, his identity remained unsettled. He admired the French Enlightenment but resented French rule over Corsica. His heroes were revolutionaries and conquerors alike, men who bent disorder into command. In 1789, the storm broke. The French Revolution erupted with the force of accumulated injustice, Bread shortages, debt, and resentment against aristocratic privilege ignited popular unrest. The fall of the Bastille signaled more than rebellion. It marked the collapse of the old order. For Napoleon, this was not merely a national crisis. It was a personal inflection point. The system that had marginalized him was disintegrating. Birth no longer guaranteed authority. Rank would soon depend on loyalty, ability, and conviction. Napoleon returned briefly to Corsica, drawn by revolutionary politics and the promise of autonomy. The island itself was fractured. Old resentments resurfaced as factions clashed between those aligned with revolutionary France and those seeking independence. Napoleon initially supported Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican nationalist leader he had once admired as a child, but political realities intervened. Paoli increasingly resisted Paris, while Napoleon, now committed to the revolution's promise of merit, chose alignment with France. The break was decisive and irreversible. Accused of betrayal, the Bonaparte family was forced to flee Corsica in 1793, escaping violence and retribution. They left behind land, identity, and the last emotional ties to their homeland. Napoleon would never return. Exile, once imposed by circumstance, became permanent by choice and consequence. France was no longer just a ruler over Corsica. It was his future. Back on the mainland, France descended into chaos. The monarchy fell. The king was executed. Europe mobilized against the revolution. Inside France, civil war and political purges consumed entire regions. The army, once aristocratic, hemorrhaged officers as nobles fled or were executed. What emerged was a vacuum, dangerous, unstable, but ripe with opportunity. Napoleon understood this shift with unusual clarity. While others reacted with fear or ideological fervor, he assessed the mechanics of change. War, he knew, would be constant, and war required competence. Artillery, once overlooked, became central to modern battlefields shaped by mass armies and fortified cities. Napoleon's expertise suddenly mattered. Promotions came faster now, driven by necessity rather than pedigree. But advancement did not mean security. France's revolutionary government was volatile. Allegiance today could mean execution tomorrow. Napoleon navigated this environment with caution and calculation. He avoided ideological extremism, positioning himself as a professional soldier loyal to France rather than to any faction. This restraint, born from years of observation, kept him alive while others fell. Yet restraint did not mean passivity. Napoleon sought command relentlessly. He volunteered for difficult assignments, wrote strategic proposals, and inserted himself into moments of crisis. He believed history favored those who acted decisively when structures collapsed. Each month of revolution validated his core belief. Chaos demanded control. His opportunity arrived amid siege and desperation. In southern France, the port city of Toulon rose in rebellion, inviting British naval forces to support royalist resistance. The threat was existential. If Toulon held, the revolution's enemies would gain a permanent foothold. The army sent to reclaim it was disorganized, its leadership uncertain. Napoleon was assigned as an artillery officer, an unglamorous role, but one that placed him near the mechanics of power. He surveyed terrain, calculated firing angles, studied supply lines. Where others saw confusion, he saw structure waiting to be imposed. The siege became a laboratory for his ideas about speed, concentration of force, and decisive action. As cannon fire echoed across the harbor and smoke rolled over the Mediterranean, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the edge of anonymity and destiny. The revolution had dismantled the world that excluded him. War had opened a path forward, and at Toulon, the test was about to begin, one that would reveal whether discipline, intellect, and ambition could truly overcome birth and tradition. History was no longer distant. It was assembling around him, gun by gun, order by order, waiting to see who could command it. The siege of Toulon unfolded beneath a sky heavy with smoke and urgency. British ships dominated the harbor, their masts rising like dark silhouettes against the sea, while revolutionary forces struggled to coordinate a coherent assault. Command was fractured. Morale was uncertain. Failure would mean more than defeat. It would signal that the revolution could not defend itself. In this crucible, Napoleon Bonaparte did not wait to be asked. He acted. He identified the true center of gravity, the heights overlooking the harbor, controlled the artillery there, and the British fleet would be forced to withdraw. It was a simple idea, rooted in geometry and logistics rather than bravado. Napoleon reorganized gun batteries, repositioned cannon under fire, and personally oversaw their deployment. He worked relentlessly, often through the night, moving among soldiers, issuing precise orders, absorbing danger without theatrics. His authority came not from rank, but from clarity. When the guns finally opened fire from the captured positions, the harbor became untenable. British ships withdrew. Toulon fell. The rebellion collapsed. The victory was decisive, and so was its aftermath. At just 24 years old, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. In the revolutionary chaos of France, such a leap was extraordinary, yet it felt inevitable. He had not merely followed orders, he had imposed structure on disorder. For the first time, the revolution recognized him not as a peripheral officer, but as a man capable of shaping outcomes. Toulon changed everything. It altered how others saw Napoleon, but more importantly, how he saw himself. The siege confirmed his deepest convictions that war was a science, not a spectacle, that leadership was earned through competence, that authority flowed to those who could impose order when systems failed. From this moment onward, Napoleon would no longer wait for history to open doors. He would force them. France, however, remained unstable. Political factions rose and fell with terrifying speed. The terror consumed its own architects. Survival required adaptability, and Napoleon proved adept at it. He aligned himself not with dogma, but with effectiveness. His loyalty was to France as a functioning state, not to ideology as performance. This distinction allowed him to outlast purges that destroyed many of his contemporaries. Yet success carried risk. Visibility invited scrutiny. Napoleon's rapid ascent earned admiration but also suspicion. He was watched carefully, reassigned, sidelined, then recalled. Each movement reinforced a lesson learned in childhood exile. Power was never given permanently. It had to be maintained. In moments of quiet, Napoleon reflected on the arc of his life. Corsica was gone, its cause abandoned. France had replaced it not as a homeland of sentiment, but as a platform of opportunity. He had severed his past and committed fully to the future unfolding before him. Identity for Napoleon was no longer inherited. It was constructed. By the mid-1790s, the revolution had transformed France into a nation permanently at war. Europe's monarchies sought to crush it. Internal rebellions threatened to tear it apart. In this environment, military commanders became political assets. The army was no longer just an instrument of policy. It was the state's backbone. Napoleon understood this before most. He saw that those who controlled armed force could shape political reality. Toulon had proven that battlefield success translated into legitimacy. From that insight would grow a career defined not only by victory, but by governance. He was still young, still untested on a grand scale, but the pattern was set. From a marginal Corsican childhood to the decisive guns of Toulon, Napoleon Bonaparte had crossed an invisible threshold. He had learned how empires crumble, how systems fail, and how individuals rise through discipline, intellect, and relentless will. The boy shaped by conquest and exile had become a man shaped by revolution and war. And France, exhausted, fearful, and searching for stability, was about to discover how much power it was willing to place in the hands of one who promised order. Thus ended the making of Napoleon, and thus began his ascent. In the final years of the 18th century, France stood beneath the weight of its own contradictions. For centuries, the kingdom had been ruled by divine right, rigid hierarchy, and inherited privilege. Yet by the late 1780s, the structure was rotting from within. The treasury was empty, the countryside restless, and the cities volatile. Bread prices soared, debt strangled the state. The nobility remained insulated, while the common people bore the cost of collapse. It was an imbalance history could no longer sustain. In 1789, the pressure broke. What began as a financial crisis became a political awakening. The Estates General convened for the first time in generations, and with it emerged a revolutionary claim that sovereignty belonged not to a king, but to a nation. When the Bastille fell, it was not merely a prison that collapsed, it was the symbol of absolute monarchy itself. Paris erupted, authority fractured, power spilled into the streets. At this moment, Napoleon Bonaparte was a junior artillery officer, young, obscure, and positioned at the margins of history. He did not lead crowds or deliver speeches. He watched, he read, he calculated. Where others felt moral exhilaration or terror, Napoleon perceived structure dissolving and reforming in real time. He understood that revolutions were not sustained by ideals alone. They were sustained by force. The old order vanished quickly. Aristocratic officers fled or were purged from the army. Rank, once secured by lineage, became suddenly negotiable. Merit, long suppressed, found violent expression. For men like Napoleon, this was not chaos alone. It was an opening. France, however, did not transition cleanly. The revolution radicalized with speed. Competing factions, the Girondins, the Jacobins, the Cordeliers, struggled for dominance. Ideology hardened. Suspicion replaced trust. Loyalty became a liability. The guillotine emerged as the revolution's most enduring image, swift, public, and absolute. Beyond France's borders, Europe reacted with alarm. Monarchies saw the revolution not as a French problem, but as a contagious threat. War followed inevitability. Austria and Prussia mobilized. Britain watched carefully, preparing to intervene. France, newly reborn, found itself encircled. In this convergence of internal collapse and external threat, the army transformed. It was no longer simply a royal institution, it became the revolution's shield and sword. Conscription expanded its ranks, discipline shifted from ceremony to necessity. The battlefield became the proving ground of legitimacy. Napoleon observed all of this with a clarity sharpened by his own marginalization. He aligned himself with the revolution, not because he was intoxicated by its rhetoric, but because it validated his deepest belief, that ability must outweigh birth. The revolution spoke the language of equality, but Napoleon listened for opportunity. He understood that in a world stripped of tradition, competence would become the ultimate currency. Yet alignment carried danger. The revolution devoured allies and enemies alike. Officers were denounced for insufficient zeal. Neutrality was interpreted as betrayal. Napoleon learned to navigate this environment carefully, expressing loyalty without fanaticism, commitment without surrendering judgment. This period reshaped his understanding of power. He saw how ideology could mobilize masses, how fear could enforce obedience, and how victory could silence doubt. Legitimacy, he realized, was not fixed. It could be constructed, reinforced, and defended through success. Order, not virtue, was what populations ultimately demanded. France was no longer a kingdom. It was a battlefield, political, social, and military. And within this furnace, a young officer was being shaped not by slogans, but by survival. The revolution did not yet elevate Napoleon Bonaparte, but it was clearing the ground on which he would rise. As the revolution accelerated, France slipped into a state of permanent urgency. Laws were rewritten in weeks, alliances collapsed overnight, and suspicion became the currency of survival. The National Convention ruled in the shadow of the guillotine, and power flowed toward those who could enforce decisions rather than merely debate them. The execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793 marked a point of no return. Europe responded with war. France responded with mobilization on a scale unseen in its history. The levée en masse transformed society into an engine of conflict. Citizens became soldiers, factories became arsenals, and ideology became fuel. The revolution demanded defense, and defense demanded organization. Yet the state lacked experienced leadership. The aristocratic officer corps had been dismantled. Many commanders were inexperienced, politically unreliable, or simply overwhelmed. Victory was no longer guaranteed by tradition. It had to be engineered under pressure. Napoleon Bonaparte watched this transformation from within the ranks. Stationed in southern France, he absorbed the new reality of warfare shaped by mass armies, rapid movement, and constant political oversight. Generals were no longer judged solely by outcomes on the battlefield, but by their perceived loyalty to revolutionary principles. Failure invited accusation. Success invited scrutiny. Napoleon adapted. He learned to speak the language of the revolution without surrendering to its excesses. His letters and writings during this period reveal a man intensely analytical rather than ideological. He criticized incompetence, studied logistics, and focused relentlessly on artillery, understanding then that modern war would be decided not by noble charges, but by firepower, positioning, and coordination. Where others relied on passion, Napoleon relied on calculation. France's internal divisions deepened. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted in the Vendée. Federalist revolts challenged Parisian authority. Cities such as Lyon and Marseille resisted central control. The revolution responded with force. Civil war bled into foreign war, and the distinction between enemy and citizen blurred. The state survived through coercion. This climate reinforced Napoleon's emerging belief that disorder invited domination, and that authority must be centralized to endure. Watching the collapse of restraint around him, he concluded that ideals without enforcement dissolved into violence. The revolution's greatest weakness, he saw, was not ambition, but fragmentation. Opportunity emerged through crisis. In 1793, the southern port city of Toulon rose against the revolutionary government, opening its harbor to British naval forces. The rebellion threatened to give France's most powerful enemy a permanent foothold on the Mediterranean. The stakes were existential. Losing Toulon would fracture France's defenses and embolden counter-revolution across the south. The army sent to suppress the revolt was disorganized. Leadership was uncertain. Supplies were scarce. Political commissioners hovered over commanders, ready to denounce hesitation as treason. Into this confusion stepped Napoleon, still young, still unremarkable in rank, but already exceptional in insight. Assigned to oversee artillery, he immediately grasped what others missed. The key was not the city itself, but the heights commanding the harbor. Control those positions, and the British fleet would be forced to withdraw. It was a solution born not of heroics, but of geometry. Napoleon reorganized batteries, trained crews, and positioned cannon with precision. He worked obsessively, ignoring exhaustion and danger. He wrote reports, argued for resources, and imposed order on chaos. Soldiers noticed, representatives noticed. Amid revolutionary fervor and fear, competence stood out. As the siege intensified, Napoleon's authority expanded beyond his rank. Decisions followed his recommendations. Guns followed his calculations. The battlefield began to bend to his logic. This was the revolution in its most revealing form. Ideology armed with artillery, survival dependent on those who could act decisively. Toulon was not yet Napoleon's triumph, but it was his proving ground. In a France where power shifted violently and rapidly, he had discovered the mechanism by which influence was earned. Not through speeches, not through birth, but through results. As cannon smoke thickened over the harbor and the fate of the revolution hung in balance, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the edge of transformation, aware, prepared, and waiting for history to respond. The fall of Toulon did more than secure a port. It revealed a new logic of power in revolutionary France. When British ships withdrew under concentrated artillery fire and the city collapsed back into Republican control, the victory carried a clear message. The revolution would survive not through rhetoric, but through competence enforced by force. And within that victory, a single name began to circulate with quiet insistence: Napoleon Bonaparte. His promotion to brigadier general came swiftly, ratified by representatives who understood what they had witnessed. At 24, Napoleon had proven something rare in a time of ideological excess. He could translate chaos into structure. In an era where loyalty was loud but skill was scarce, he had delivered results without spectacle. This distinction mattered. France, however, did not pause to celebrate. The revolution pressed forward with relentless momentum. The reign of terror intensified. Committees ruled through suspicion. The guillotine worked without rest. Victory on the battlefield offered only temporary insulation from political danger. Napoleon understood this precarious balance. His success had elevated him, but elevation also meant visibility. He was reassigned, then sidelined, then recalled. These abrupt shifts were not punishments. They were symptoms of a state struggling to stabilize itself. France had become a nation governed by emergency, where institutions were provisional and authority provisional with them. In such a system, consistency was rare, but opportunity was constant. Napoleon adapted once again. He learned to exist within political turbulence without being consumed by it. He cultivated relationships carefully, avoided ideological absolutism, and presented himself as indispensable yet restrained. He spoke in the language of republican virtue when required, but always framed his actions in terms of necessity, order, and national survival. This pragmatism, often mistaken for opportunism, was in fact a survival strategy refined since childhood exile. More importantly, he was learning something deeper: that military power and political authority were converging. The revolution had stripped legitimacy from monarchy, but it had not yet replaced it with stability. France was ruled by committees, councils, and conventions, but none commanded universal trust. The army, by contrast, delivered tangible outcomes. It defended borders, it suppressed rebellions, it preserved the revolution by force of arms. Those who led it effectively gained moral and political weight far beyond their formal rank. Napoleon saw this with clarity. He studied not only campaigns, but the behavior of power itself. He observed how generals who succeeded were elevated, while those who failed were erased. He noted how fear governed decision-making and how victory could silence ideological doubt. From this environment emerged a conviction that would define his life. Legitimacy could be manufactured through order, through security, through success. The revolution had not made Napoleon a revolutionary in spirit. It had made him a realist. By the mid-1790s, France had become a permanent war state. Surrounded by enemies and fractured within, it relied increasingly on its generals to sustain the revolution's existence. In this context, ambition was no longer a vice. It was a qualification. The state required men willing to act decisively, regardless of tradition or restraint. Napoleon was ready. His early experiences, Corsican marginalization, academic isolation, revolutionary upheaval, had forged a man uniquely suited to this moment. He was emotionally restrained, intellectually rigorous, and unburdened by loyalty to the old order. He did not mourn the monarchy. He did not romanticize the revolution. He saw both as systems, and systems, he believed, could be optimized. France had ignited itself in the name of equality and reason. But fire, once lit, does not govern itself. It spreads, consumes, and demands direction. By the time the revolution reached its most violent phase, it was already searching for men capable of controlling what it had unleashed. Napoleon Bonaparte was not yet such a man in the eyes of the nation, but he was becoming one in his own. Our own. The revolution had stripped away the scaffolding of inherited power and exposed the mechanics beneath. It taught Napoleon how rapidly authority could shift, how fear could mobilize obedience, and how victory could sanctify command. It taught him that chaos does not eliminate hierarchy. It accelerates its reconstruction around those who can impose order. From the streets of Paris to the batteries of Toulon, France was being remade by force and necessity, and within this transformation, a young general was absorbing lessons that would soon carry him far beyond the limits of his rank. The revolution did not create Napoleon Bonaparte, but it cleared the ground, shattered the barriers, and forged the conditions that made his rise not only possible, but inevitable. And as France burned through ideology toward exhaustion, the question shifted from who could speak for the revolution to who could command it. Beneath the sharp southern light of the Mediterranean coast, the port city of Toulon became the crucible in which Napoleon Bonaparte first stepped unmistakably into history. The year was 1793, and revolutionary France stood at its most vulnerable. Internally fractured by rebellion and terror, externally threatened by Europe's monarchies, the young republic faced a danger that cut straight to its naval heart. Toulon was not just another city. It was France's primary Mediterranean naval base, a gateway to the sea, a symbol of maritime power, and a strategic lifeline. When royalist factions within the city rose against the revolutionary government and opened the harbor to British, Spanish, and Neapolitan fleets, the betrayal struck deep. Foreign warships anchored calmly beneath French fortifications. Tricolor flags were torn down. White flags of monarchy fluttered in their place. For the revolution, the loss of Toulon was existential. If the city remained in enemy hands, Britain would gain permanent access to southern France. The revolution's enemies would be emboldened. Other regions might follow. The Republic could fracture before it fully formed. Paris responded with urgency and fear, dispatching an army hastily assembled from conscripts, veterans, political appointees, and revolutionary commissioners whose authority often exceeded their competence. The siege began amid confusion. Command was divided, plans contradicted one another. Officers feared failure as much as they feared political denunciation. In revolutionary France, losing a battle could mean losing one's head. Strategy was paralyzed by caution, and caution by terror. It was into this volatile environment that Napoleon Bonaparte arrived, not as a commander, but as an artillery officer. He was 24 years old, unknown beyond limited military circles, and still burdened by the memory of exile from Corsica. Yet he possessed something most around him lacked: clarity. Napoleon surveyed the terrain with a mathematician's eye. He ignored ceremonial concerns and political noise, focusing instead on the geometry of war. The city itself, he quickly realized, was not the decisive objective. The harbor was. And the harbor was dominated by high ground, rocky promontories overlooking the anchorage where British ships lay vulnerable. To Napoleon, the solution was obvious. Artillery, properly placed, could control the sea. If cannon could command the harbor, the enemy fleet would have no choice but to withdraw. The rebellion would collapse without foreign support. Toulon would fall, not through frontal assault, but through systemic pressure. This was not how wars had traditionally been fought. Commanders still thought in terms of honor, lines, and heroic charges. Napoleon thought in terms of systems, firepower, supply, positioning, and inevitability. War, to him, was not theater. It was mechanics. He began reorganizing the artillery almost immediately. Batteries were repositioned. Guns were concentrated rather than dispersed. Crews were trained relentlessly, drilled to operate with speed and precision under fire. Napoleon worked constantly, through rain, smoke, and exhaustion, moving between positions, correcting angles, recalculating ranges. His intensity was unmistakable. Soldiers noticed the young officer who slept little, spoke precisely, and exposed himself to danger without drama. Representatives on mission, political overseers tasked with ensuring revolutionary loyalty, noticed something rarer, competence that produced results. Resistance was fierce. Royalist forces fought hard. Allied navies bombarded positions, casualties mounted. Napoleon himself was wounded during the fighting, struck while directing battery placements. He returned to duty almost immediately. Pain was irrelevant. The plan had to be executed. Gradually, methodically, the French artillery tightened its grip. Heights were taken. Guns were installed. The harbor came under sustained fire. British commanders assessed the situation with growing concern. Ships could not remain anchored under such pressure. Losses mounted. The position was no longer defensible. When the Allied fleet finally withdrew, it did so not in defeat alone, but in recognition of inevitability. Toulon fell soon after. The rebellion collapsed. The tricolor was raised once more above the city. France's Mediterranean lifeline was secured. The revolution had survived one of its most dangerous trials. And in the aftermath of victory, a transformation occurred, quiet, administrative, but momentous. Napoleon Bonaparte was promoted to brigadier general. The decision was swift, pragmatic, and telling. In a France that claimed to reward virtue, it was results that mattered most. At 24, Napoleon had demonstrated not only bravery, but a new way of thinking about war. He had imposed order on chaos. He had delivered certainty where fear had paralyzed others. This was his first fame, not yet the roar of legend, but the opening note. From the smoke of Toulon, a new figure emerged in the Republic's consciousness, a commander who understood that modern warfare was not about spectacle, but control. And once such control is demonstrated, it is never forgotten. Victory at Toulon did not deliver peace. It delivered attention. And in revolutionary France, attention was a volatile currency. The promotion of Napoleon Bonaparte to brigadier general placed him abruptly into a world where military command and political survival were inseparable. He had proven his usefulness, but usefulness did not guarantee safety. The revolution rewarded success, yet distrusted those who rose too quickly. Every general was both asset and suspect, praised one day and denounced the next. Napoleon understood this instinctively. His triumph had lifted him into visibility, and visibility invited danger. France. In 1794 was governed less by institutions than by fear. The Committee of Public Safety wielded extraordinary authority, overseeing war, internal security, and ideological purity. Loyalty was measured not only by actions, but by tone, associations, and timing. Officers were expected to be revolutionary without appearing ambitious, effective without appearing independent. It was a balance few managed for long. Napoleon navigated this landscape with restraint. He did not boast about Toulon. He framed his actions as necessity rather than genius, obedience rather than initiative. Yet beneath this surface compliance, he was consolidating something far more important than rank: reputation. Among soldiers, his name carried weight. He had worked alongside them, shared danger, and delivered victory. Among political representatives, he was remembered as reliable and decisive. In a system desperate for order, such qualities were invaluable. The revolution spoke endlessly of equality, but in practice, it relied on those who could impose discipline. Napoleon's next assignments were shaped by this contradiction. He was sent where control was fragile, where artillery expertise mattered, where outcomes were uncertain. Each task expanded his understanding of war as a total system: logistics, morale, terrain, politics, timing. He saw how armies disintegrated without supply, how enthusiasm collapsed without structure, how authority evaporated without enforcement. He also saw how quickly power shifted. The fall of Robespierre in July 1794 ended the terror and exposed how precarious revolutionary legitimacy truly was. Those who had ruled absolutely were themselves overthrown almost overnight. Napoleon, briefly associated with Robespierre's brother, found himself arrested and imprisoned. For days his fate hung unresolved. Execution was a real possibility. He survived, not through influence, but through obscurity and the absence of accusation. When released, he emerged chastened but sharpened. The lesson was unmistakable. Ideology was temporary. Competence endured. The revolution did not protect its servants. It consumed them when convenient. Napoleon adjusted accordingly. He withdrew from factional alignment and focused it on professional excellence. He wrote military memoranda, proposed reforms, studied campaigns obsessively. He understood that France would remain at war for years, perhaps decades, and in that reality, the state would always need men who could deliver results quickly and decisively. This period deepened his conception of authority. He had seen mobs overthrow kings, committees overthrow generals, and generals overthrow chaos. Power, he concluded, was not moral, it was functional. It belonged to those who could stabilize disorder and defend the state when ideology failed. The army itself was changing. Mass conscription had transformed it into a national force, but discipline remained uneven. Officers rose rapidly, often without experience. Napoleon distinguished himself by imposing coherence. He believed morale was built not through slogans, but through confidence in leadership. Soldiers fought better when they trusted their commander's competence. Quietly, his ambitions sharpened. Toulon had proven that battlefield success could translate into political capital, but it had also revealed the dangers of premature prominence. Napoleon began to think in longer arcs about sustained command, independent authority, and the possibility of shaping events rather than merely responding to them. France, meanwhile, drifted toward exhaustion. The revolutionary government stabilized into the Directory, a regime defined by corruption, inefficiency, and reliance on the army to maintain order. Civil unrest simmered, royalist threats persisted. The state increasingly leaned on military solutions for political problems. Napoleon observed this convergence closely. He had risen through the revolution's chaos, but he did not belong to its idealism. He belonged to its consequences. Toulon had been his proof of concept, a demonstration that order could be imposed through precision, calculation, and will. What remained was scale. And France, fractured and weary, was becoming a place where scale mattered more than virtue. The young general was no longer anonymous. He was no longer marginal. He was waiting for a moment when competence alone would not suffice, and command would be demanded. History was moving again, and Napoleon Bonaparte was ready to move with it. By the mid-1790s, the meaning of Toulon had fully matured in Napoleon Bonaparte's mind. It was no longer simply a victory, it was a lesson. The revolution had revealed its deepest truth there, that power did not flow from ideals alone, but from those who could impose order when ideals collapsed into violence. Toulon was the moment Napoleon stopped thinking like an officer advancing within a system, and began thinking like a man who could one day command the system itself. France under the Directory drifted without conviction. 5 men governed a nation at war on every frontier, yet none inspired loyalty or confidence. Corruption spread openly, elections were manipulated, bread riots returned to Paris. The revolution had survived, but it had not stabilized. Authority existed, but legitimacy was thin. The state leaned increasingly on the army to maintain internal order and defend external borders. This dependency reshaped the balance of power. Generals were no longer merely executors of policy. They were guarantors of the state's survival. Those who delivered victory gained leverage. Those who failed disappeared. Napoleon watched this transformation with careful distance. He did not challenge authority openly. He allowed others to underestimate him. But internally, his ambitions sharpened with clarity. Toulon had given him credibility. Survival through political purges had given him caution. Together, they forged a mindset both disciplined and opportunistic. In 1795, the convergence became unavoidable. Paris erupted once again, this time not from radical revolutionaries, but from royalists seeking to restore the monarchy. The Directory panicked. The capital, symbol of revolutionary authority, stood vulnerable. It turned to the army for salvation. Napoleon was summoned. The response he delivered was decisive and unsentimental. He deployed artillery in the streets of Paris and crushed the uprising with concentrated fire. There were no speeches, no negotiations, only order imposed through force. The threat ended in hours. It was brutal, it was effective, and it echoed Toulon in a new form. This moment confirmed what Toulon had first revealed, that Napoleon understood violence not as excess, but as a tool, one to be applied precisely, sparingly, and without hesitation. The Directory rewarded him with command of the Army of Italy, one of France's most neglected forces. The transition was complete. From that point forward, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer simply rising within the revolution. He was becoming indispensable to its survival. His authority now extended beyond the battlefield into the political bloodstream of France. Success brought patronage. Patronage brought autonomy. Autonomy brought opportunity. Yet Toulon remained the origin. It was there that Napoleon demonstrated a new grammar of warfare, one defined by systems, speed, and inevitability rather than tradition and display. It was there that revolutionary ideology bent to technical competence. It was there that France first glimpsed the kind of leader who could thrive amid collapse. Toulon did not make Napoleon famous in the popular imagination. That would come later, in Italy and beyond. But it made him legible to power. It proved that a young, obscure Corsican could command outcomes that altered the course of the Republic. More importantly, it shaped Napoleon's internal logic of rule. He believed now, with evidence, that legitimacy could be earned through success, maintained through order, and defended through force. He believed that history favored those who acted decisively when institutions hesitated. He believed that chaos, once mastered, could be turned into authority. The revolution had shattered France's past. At Toulon, Napoleon learned how to shape its future. And as the Republic drifted toward exhaustion, it would soon turn not to ideals or assemblies, but to men who could command armies, restore order, and promise stability at any cost. The age of the general was beginning. By 1795, the French Revolution had survived its most violent convulsions, but it had not healed. The terror had burned itself out, leaving behind a nation exhausted, suspicious, and fractured. Robespierre was gone. The guillotine slowed, yet stability did not follow. In place of revolutionary zeal stood the Directory, a five-man executive body plagued by corruption, indecision, and a fatal dependence on force it could not fully control. France was no longer governed by ideals alone. It was governed by fear of collapse. The economy staggered. Inflation devoured wages. Bread shortages returned to Paris, reviving the anger of the streets. Royalist sentiment, long suppressed, resurfaced openly. Monarchists believed the revolution had gone too far and then lost its nerve. They sensed weakness. They prepared to strike. On 13 Vendémiaire, Year 4 of the revolutionary calendar, October 5th, 1795. Paris stood on the brink once more. Tens of thousands of armed royalists advanced toward the heart of the city, determined to overthrow the Directory and restore the monarchy. The threat was immediate, massive, and terrifying. If Paris fell, the revolution would fall with it. The Directory panicked. It had no charismatic leaders, no loyal popular support, and no faith in its own authority. Once again, the state turned to the only institution capable of decisive action, the army. And once again, Napoleon Bonaparte was summoned. At 26 years old, Napoleon was still young, but he was no longer obscure. Toulon had marked him as competent. Survival through political purges had marked him as cautious. He arrived in Paris not as an ideologue, but as a professional soldier summoned to solve a political problem with military means. What he found was chaos. Defensive preparations were inadequate. Command structures were confused. The city's leadership debated while the threat advanced. Time was disappearing. Napoleon did not argue philosophy. He assessed terrain. Paris, he understood, was not a battlefield of fields and fortresses. It was a maze of streets, bridges, and choke points. Control depended on positioning, not persuasion. The enemy's strength lay in numbers. Napoleon's lay in artillery. He acted immediately. Cannons were positioned along key avenues leading to the Tuileries Palace. Streets were sealed. Fields of fire were calculated. Soldiers were instructed with clarity and brevity. There would be no negotiation, no retreat, no symbolism. When the royalist columns advanced, they met not speeches, but grape-shot. The effect was devastating. Artillery fired directly into the crowd, shredding formations and breaking momentum within minutes. Panic spread. The assault collapsed. By nightfall, the rebellion was crushed. Paris was secured. The Directory survived. History would remember the moment as the whiff of grape-shot, a phrase that reduced bloodshed to metaphor, but for Napoleon, it was something else entirely. Proof. Proof that force, applied decisively and without hesitation, could settle political questions faster than any assembly or decree. Proof that sentiment was irrelevant when the state itself was threatened. Proof that control of the army equaled control of the nation. The Directory understood this as well. Napoleon was not merely rewarded, he was elevated. He became the regime's indispensable sword, the man who had saved the revolution when words had failed. His authority expanded rapidly. Doors opened. Influence followed. Yet something more subtle occurred within Napoleon himself. Vendémiaire confirmed a belief forged in earlier years, that order mattered more than ideals, and survival outweighed moral hesitation. The revolution had proclaimed liberty, but it had survived only through violence. Napoleon no longer questioned this contradiction. He accepted it as historical reality. From this moment forward, his relationship with the state changed. He was no longer simply serving France. He was protecting it. And protection, he understood, conferred power. Paris also introduced Napoleon to another force, social and political influence. Through the salons of the capital, he met Josephine de Beauharnais, charming, well-connected, and deeply embedded in post-revolutionary elite networks. Their relationship moved quickly, blending affection, ambition, and opportunity. Marriage to Josephine did not bring wealth, but it brought access. Through her, Napoleon entered circles where decisions were shaped, alliances formed, and futures negotiated. At the same time, the Directory rewarded him with something far more dangerous than prestige: command of the Army of Italy. This was not merely a military appointment, it was autonomy. The Army of Italy was underfunded, undersupplied, and largely neglected, a forgotten front of the Revolution's wars. But it was also distant from Paris, distant from oversight, and distant from political interference. For a man who had learned how fragile power was in the capital, this distance mattered. As Napoleon prepared to leave Paris, the balance had shifted irreversibly. The revolution still spoke the language of republican virtue. But France now survived through generals, and among them one stood apart, young, disciplined, ruthless in clarity, and increasingly aware that the army was no longer an instrument of power. It was the source of it. Napoleon departed Paris in the spring of 1796 as a newly married man and a newly empowered general. The contrast between appearances and reality was stark. On paper, the Army of Italy was one of France's least important commands. It was underpaid, poorly clothed, and chronically undersupplied. Its soldiers marched barefoot. Its officers were demoralized. To many in the Directory, the appointment was a convenient way to remove an ambitious general from the capital while placing him where failure would be quietly tolerated. Napoleon saw something else entirely. Northern Italy was not a backwater. It was a corridor, a place where Austrian power, local monarchies, and fragile alliances intersected. Whoever controlled it could destabilize Central Europe, threaten Vienna, and redraw the balance of the war. More importantly, it was far from Paris. There, success would be measured by outcomes alone, and outcomes, Napoleon believed, could be engineered. When he arrived to take command, the army expected little. They saw a thin, intense officer barely older than many of them. No imposing stature, no flamboyant confidence. But within days, their perceptions shifted. Napoleon spoke to them directly, not in the language of ideology, but in the language of survival. He promised food, pay, and glory, but only through discipline and movement. He demanded speed. He demanded obedience, and he demanded trust in his plan. This was leadership as Napoleon understood it, not charisma, but clarity. He reorganized the army immediately. Units were consolidated, march routes recalculated, supplies were seized locally to sustain momentum. Where previous commanders had hesitated, Napoleon advanced. He moved his forces with a speed that stunned both allies and enemies, dividing opposing armies and defeating them in detail before they could coordinate. Each victory reinforced a pattern he had already recognized. Success generated loyalty. Soldiers who had been neglected now felt led. Officers who had doubted now followed. Authority, once established through results, multiplied itself. Meanwhile, the Directory watched from Paris with growing unease. Napoleon's victories brought prestige, not to the government but to the general. He negotiated with Italian states directly. He imposed treaties, he extracted contributions and redirected resources without waiting for approval. His correspondence with Paris was respectful but firm, informative but independent. He was no longer merely executing policy, he was shaping it. This autonomy marked a turning point. For the first time, Napoleon commanded not just an army, but a political instrument. He distributed rewards, appointed local authorities, and enforced order. The revolution's ideals followed behind his cannon, filtered through necessity. Liberty became secondary to stability. Equality yielded to hierarchy. And yet, to many in Italy, French rule appeared more rational and efficient than the fragmented systems it replaced. Napoleon absorbed this lesson carefully. He saw that populations exhausted by disorder did not resist authority. They welcomed it, provided it delivered security. The army was not only a weapon of war, it was a mechanism of governance. Through it, he could impose law, collect resources, and create legitimacy where none existed before. Back in Paris, the Directory grew increasingly dependent on his success. Each victory filled the treasury, each treaty delayed collapse, and each success deepened the contradiction at the heart of revolutionary France, a republic that survived only because of generals it could not fully control. Napoleon understood this imbalance better than anyone. He had saved the Directory once with a grapeshot. He now sustained it with victory, and in doing so, he learned a crucial truth. The state that relies on military force for survival eventually yields authority to those who command it. His marriage to Josephine, meanwhile, bound him more tightly to France's political elite. Through her connections, he gained insight into the fragility of the regime, the rivalries within the Directory, and the fear that haunted its leaders. They needed him, but they feared him. That tension did not trouble Napoleon. It confirmed his instincts. Power, he had learned, was never given freely. It was accumulated quietly, legitimized by success, and secured through force. The army was the conduit. Italy was the proving ground. Paris was watching. As his campaigns accelerated and his reputation spread across Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed another invisible threshold. He was no longer a general rising within the revolution. He was becoming a force upon which the revolution itself depended. And dependence, he knew, was the first step toward command. As the Italian campaign unfolded, its consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Each victory Napoleon delivered tightened the bond between military success and political survival in France. The Directory depended on him not only for security, but for legitimacy. Treaties signed in Milan and contributions extracted from defeated states flowed back to Paris, funding a government that could barely sustain itself without the spoils of conquest. Napoleon had become the engine of stability for a regime built on uncertainty. This reality did not escape him. He observed how authority responded to strength, how fear yielded to results, and how distance from Paris granted freedom of action. In Italy, he ruled with efficiency and intent. He reorganized administrations, enforced discipline, and projected power through speed and decisiveness. To soldiers, he was a provider. To enemies, an inevitability. To allies, a negotiator whose words carried the weight of cannon. The army was no longer simply obeying orders. It was following a leader. Napoleon understood the psychological dimension of command. He cultivated loyalty through shared hardship and reward, binding his soldiers to him personally. He spoke of honor but delivered bread. He spoke of glory but ensured survival. Morale became a strategic asset, carefully maintained and deployed. This was not charisma in the traditional sense. It was credibility earned through consistency. Meanwhile, in Paris, unease deepened. The Directory's authority eroded as Napoleon's fame expanded. Newspapers carried reports of his victories. His name became synonymous with success. The public admired him. The politicians feared him. The revolution, born to dismantle concentrated power, was now sustained by it. Napoleon did not challenge this contradiction openly. He did not need to. He allowed events to mature. He had learned patience from exile, restraint from survival, and confidence from Toulon and Vendémiaire. He understood that timing mattered as much as force. Power seized too early invited destruction. Power accepted reluctantly appeared legitimate. By the end of the Italian campaign, the transformation was complete. Napoleon Bonaparte had proven that military authority could eclipse civil weakness. He had demonstrated that order, imposed swiftly and decisively, was preferable to ideological paralysis. He had shown that the army, when commanded with clarity, could stabilize nations, reshape borders, and dictate political outcomes. France had found its protector. It did not yet recognize that it had also found its future ruler. The Directory still governed in name. Assemblies still debated. Laws were still passed. But beneath these structures lay an unspoken truth. The survival of the state depended on men who could command force, and among them, Napoleon stood unmatched. From grapeshot in Paris to victories in Italy, he had refined a doctrine that would define his life. That power flowed upward from the battlefield, not downward from institutions. That legitimacy followed success. That order justified authority. The revolution had broken the old world. Napoleon was learning how to build a new one upon its ruins. And as France drifted toward exhaustion, it would soon look not to assemblies or ideals, but to the general who had already proven he could protect the nation when no one else could. The soldier had become a power. In the spring of 1796, as winter loosened its grip on the Alps, Napoleon Bonaparte took command of the Army of Italy and stepped into a campaign that would redefine not only his own destiny, but the very nature of modern warfare. The army he inherited was exhausted and neglected, poorly clothed, underpaid, and chronically hungry. Its men had marched for years with little reward and less recognition. To the Directory in Paris, this force was an afterthought. To Napoleon, it was raw potential. Italy itself was fragmented and vulnerable. A mosaic of duchies, kingdoms, and republics lay scattered between the Alps and the Mediterranean, bound together loosely by Austrian influence and outdated alliances. The terrain was unforgiving, mountains, rivers, narrow valleys, but it also offered opportunity. Napoleon saw Italy not as a single front, but as a sequence of problems to be solved in rapid succession. From the beginning, he rejected the slow, formalized warfare of Europe's old generals. He believed speed could substitute for numbers and precision for mass. His plan was audacious: move faster than the enemy could react, separate Allied forces before they could unite, and strike decisively at each in turn. War, in his mind, was not about annihilation. It was about dislocation. He began by addressing morale. Standing before soldiers who had been promised everything and given nothing, Napoleon spoke plainly. He acknowledged their suffering and offered them a bargain: discipline and obedience in exchange for victory, food, and glory. It was not rhetoric, it was a contract. He made it clear that Italy would supply what Paris had failed to provide. Survival would come through movement. Reward would come through conquest. The army responded. Within weeks, Napoleon launched a series of rapid maneuvers that stunned his opponents. Austrian and Piedmontese forces, accustomed to deliberate campaigns, found themselves outpaced and outflanked. Napoleon exploited interior lines, moving his army between enemy forces before they could coordinate. Battles came quickly: Montenotte, Millesimo, Dego, each one breaking resistance before it could solidify. Victory bred momentum. Napoleon's presence on the battlefield was constant. He appeared where pressure was greatest, issuing orders with calm intensity, correcting movements, and reinforcing success. His soldiers began to trust his judgment instinctively. They followed him not because of rank, but because he delivered results. In a revolutionary army built on citizen soldiers, this trust was decisive. As victories accumulated, so did resources. Italian cities paid contributions, supplies flowed, the army fed itself from its successes. What began as desperation became efficiency. Napoleon understood the cycle. Speed produced victory, victory produced supply, supply sustained speed. War became a self-reinforcing system. Europe began to notice. Austria, long dominant in northern Italy, struggled to respond. Its generals were cautious, bound by rigid hierarchies and slow communication. Napoleon exploited these weaknesses relentlessly. He fought not battles of attrition, but battles of position and morale. Each defeat demoralized the enemy and emboldened his own forces. Yet the Italian campaign was not only military, it was political. Napoleon negotiated directly with defeated states, imposing terms without waiting for Paris. He reorganized territories, installed sympathetic governments, and framed French dominance as liberation from feudal rule. To some Italians, French troops appeared as modernizers, to others as occupiers. Napoleon understood both reactions and used them accordingly. For the first time, He acted not merely as a general, but as a statesman. The Directory watched uneasily. Napoleon's dispatches read less like reports and more like proclamations. He spoke of strategy, administration, and reform with equal authority. His name circulated in newspapers across France. He became a symbol of victory in a nation starved for success. By the end of 1796, the transformation was undeniable. Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer simply commanding an army. He was commanding attention, loyalty, and fear. And as winter approached once more, the Italian campaign was far from over. Greater battles lay ahead, greater risks, and with each step forward, Napoleon moved closer to something more dangerous than defeat: independence. As the campaign pushed deeper into Italy, the war sharpened into a contest of endurance, intellect, and nerve. By early 1797, Napoleon's army had crossed rivers thought impassable, seized fortresses believed secure, and dismantled coalitions faster than Europe could comprehend. Each engagement followed the same underlying logic: speed over ceremony, concentration over dispersion, decision over delay. The Austrians, reeling from earlier defeats, attempted to regroup along natural barriers: the Adige, the Brenta, the marshes surrounding Mantua. Mantua itself became the focal point of the campaign. A formidable fortress surrounded by swamps, it anchored Austrian power in northern Italy. If it held, Austria could return. If it fell, the road to Vienna would open. Napoleon chose pressure over patience. Rather than committing to a long, static siege, he maneuvered aggressively around Mantua, striking relief armies as they approached and destroying them one by one. At Castiglione, Bassano, Arcole, and Rivoli, Napoleon demonstrated a mastery of timing and terrain that confounded his enemies. He lured larger forces into unfavorable positions, then struck with concentrated violence at the decisive point. The Battle of Arcole revealed his personal command style with striking clarity. Amid marshland and chaos, as French troops hesitated under fire, Napoleon seized a flag and moved forward himself, attempting to rally the line. Though nearly killed in the attempt, the act reinforced something essential: his presence mattered. Soldiers did not see a distant commander. They saw a leader who shared risk. Courage, when paired with competence, became contagious. At Rivoli in January 1797, Napoleon delivered one of the most decisive victories of the campaign. Outnumbered, he anticipated enemy movements with precision, reinforcing threatened positions at the exact moment pressure peaked. Austrian columns collapsed under coordinated artillery and infantry fire. Mantua surrendered shortly thereafter. With that surrender, Austrian dominance in Italy effectively ended. The consequences were immediate and profound. Napoleon now controlled vast territories and commanded an army that had become fiercely loyal. His soldiers followed him with devotion born not of ideology, but of experience. He had led them through hunger and victory, chaos and triumph. He had delivered what the state had failed to provide. Dead Sepoli. Meanwhile, the political implications deepened. Napoleon negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio directly with Austria, bypassing the Directory's diplomats. The treaty reshaped Europe's map, dissolving old states and redistributing territory. France emerged stronger, Austria retreated, and Napoleon acted not as an emissary, but as an equal. This autonomy marked a radical departure from tradition. Generals did not make peace, states did. Yet Napoleon had crossed that boundary without permission and without consequence. The Directory accepted the treaty because it needed the result. Once again, success legitimized authority. Across Europe, monarchies took note. Napoleon's methods unsettled them. He did not fight like traditional generals. He did not pause to consolidate. He did not respect inherited structures. He moved relentlessly, exploiting weakness, dissolving alliances, and reshaping regions with startling speed. The Old World had never faced such a figure, one who combined revolutionary energy with disciplined command. In France, his fame expanded beyond military circles. Newspapers celebrated his victories. Artists depicted him as the embodiment of Republican triumph. Citizens spoke his name with admiration. For a nation weary of instability, Napoleon represented clarity, decisive, effective, victorious. Yet Napoleon himself remained unsentimental. He studied the reactions around him carefully. He saw how victory elevated him beyond the reach of ordinary authority. He saw how fear and admiration altered political behavior. And he drew the inevitable conclusion: power did not need to be seized loudly. It accrued naturally to those who delivered results consistently. The Italian campaign had given him something no decree could grant: independent legitimacy. He now commanded an army that trusted him more than the government. He negotiated with foreign powers as an equal. He redistributed wealth and territory. He shaped narratives. War had become his language of authority, and he spoke it fluently. But with each victory, a new tension emerged. Napoleon was still, officially, a servant of the Directory, yet in practice, he had become something else entirely: a national hero, a political force, and a symbol of order born from chaos. The revolution had promised equality, but it had elevated a man who now stood unmistakably above his peers. As 1797 drew to a close, Europe watched with growing unease. France celebrated. The Directory hesitated. And Napoleon Bonaparte, standing at the apex of his first great campaign, understood that Italy had been more than a battlefield. It had been a demonstration. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte departed Italy in late 1797, the campaign had ceased to be merely a military success. It had become a statement of possibility. In less than 2 years, a neglected army had shattered one of Europe's great powers, redrawn borders, and altered the balance of the continent. The transformation was so complete that it forced France and Europe to reconsider what leadership in the age of revolution truly meant. Napoleon returned not as a general reporting to the state, but as a figure the state had learned to depend upon. The wealth extracted from Italy flowed into French coffers, temporarily stabilizing a government that could not stabilize itself. Art treasures, resources, and strategic territories followed. The Directory accepted these gains with gratitude and anxiety, aware that they had been delivered by a man operating increasingly beyond their control. Napoleon understood this tension and did not rush to resolve it. Instead, he cultivated his image carefully. He allowed newspapers to celebrate him. He tolerated comparisons to ancient conquerors. He encouraged artists and writers to portray his victories as national triumphs. Public admiration became a shield against political interference. The more France associated success with his name, the more costly it became to oppose him. Yet beneath the spectacle lay method. Napoleon had refined a system of war that prioritized mobility, morale, and concentrated force. He had demonstrated that armies need not be large to be decisive, provided they moved faster and struck smarter. He had shown that command presence, calm, visible, deliberate, could transform raw conscripts into disciplined instruments of power. These lessons would endure. Italy also revealed the administrative dimension of conquest. Napoleon had governed territories, reorganized institutions, and imposed order with remarkable efficiency. He understood that victory was temporary unless followed by structure. In Italy, he tested the idea that the general could also be a governor and succeed at both. The political implications were unmistakable. For the Directory, Napoleon's success was both salvation and threat. He had saved France from military humiliation, yet exposed the weakness of civilian authority. The revolution had dismantled monarchy, but had not replaced it with a stable alternative. Into that vacuum stepped generals, and among them, Napoleon stood unrivaled. Europe's monarchies watched with growing alarm. They had dismissed the French Revolution as temporary chaos. They now faced a commander who combined revolutionary energy with disciplined command, who fought wars with speed and negotiated peace with authority. The threat was no longer ideological. It was personal. Napoleon sensed this shift in perception. He no longer thought of himself as merely responding to events. He was shaping them. Italy had proven that his judgment could alter history's direction, and once such awareness settles in, it cannot be undone. Yet he also understood the limits of momentum. Power consolidated too quickly invites resistance. The Directory still ruled in Paris. The army still obeyed in name. Timing, he believed, would determine everything. As he prepared for what came next, Napoleon carried with him the lessons Italy had etched into his mind. That war was a system, not a gamble. That authority followed success, and that nations, exhausted by disorder, would accept strong leadership in exchange for stability. Italy had been his proving ground. From its mountains and plains emerged a new kind of leader, one who blurred the line between general and statesman, between servant and master. The revolution had created the conditions for his rise. Italy had transformed potential into reality. And as France drifted toward deeper uncertainty, one truth became increasingly clear. Victory no longer served the government. Victory served Napoleon Bonaparte. And with Europe watching, the man forged in revolution now turned his gaze beyond the continent, toward a horizon where ambition would test its own limits. In the summer of 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte turned his gaze away from Europe and toward the ancient world. France, exhausted by years of continental war, stood locked in an unresolved struggle with Britain. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. Direct invasion was impossible, and yet Napoleon, now the most celebrated general of the Republic, proposed something audacious, not to confront Britain head-on, but to strike at the foundations of its global power. Egypt was the key. Situated between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, Egypt was a strategic crossroads linking Europe to India, the jewel of the British Empire. Control it, Napoleon argued, and Britain's commercial lifeline would be threatened. But Egypt offered more than strategy. It offered symbolism. Conquest there would echo the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Caesar, elevating France and Napoleon beyond the narrow confines of revolutionary Europe. The Directory approved the expedition for practical and political reasons. It promised to weaken Britain. It promised glory. And perhaps most importantly, it removed Napoleon from Paris. His popularity had become unsettling. Egypt was distant, dangerous, and uncertain, an elegant solution to an internal problem. Napoleon accepted eagerly. Unlike traditional military expeditions, this one carried more than soldiers. Over 160 scholars, scientists, engineers, artists, and linguists joined the Armada, collectively known as the Savants. Their mission was unprecedented: to study, measure, catalog, and understand Egypt in its entirety. Napoleon envisioned not just conquest, but transformation. He would bring reason, order, and enlightenment to the East, at least as he defined it. In July 1798, the French fleet landed near Alexandria beneath a blinding desert sun. The soldiers, trained for European battlefields, struggled against heat, sand, and thirst. Egypt was not merely foreign, it was alien. Minarets pierced the skyline. Ancient ruins rose from the dust. The weight of history pressed heavily upon the campaign. Napoleon moved quickly inland toward Cairo, aware that hesitation would be fatal. His first major confrontation came against the Mamluks, elite cavalry warriors who had ruled Egypt for centuries. Their charges were fearsome, their confidence absolute. Napoleon responded with geometry. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he formed his infantry into hollow squares, bristling with bayonets and artillery. Mamluk cavalry crashed against disciplined fire and collapsed. The victory was decisive. Cairo fell. Napoleon proclaimed himself liberator and ruler, adopting Islamic imagery while asserting French authority. On land, his genius remained intact. But at sea, disaster waited. While Napoleon consolidated control in Egypt, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson tracked the French Armada. In August 1798, at Abu Qir Bay, Nelson struck. The Battle of the Nile was catastrophic. Ship after ship was destroyed. The French fleet was annihilated. Napoleon was now trapped, cut off from France, surrounded by hostile territory and isolated from reinforcements. His expedition teetered on the edge of ruin. Strategically, the campaign had failed. Control of Egypt without naval support was unsustainable. Yet Napoleon did not collapse. He adapted. He turned inward, toward governance, reform, and legacy. In Cairo, he founded the Institut d'Egypte, bringing scholars together to study mathematics, natural history, engineering, and antiquity. Surveys were conducted, temples measured, hieroglyphs copied. The Rosetta Stone was discovered during this period, though its significance would be realized later. Egypt became not only a theater of war, but a laboratory of knowledge. Napoleon governed as an imperial administrator. He restructured taxation, regulated trade, and imposed order through a mixture of force and spectacle. He presented himself as protector of Islam, even as resistance simmered beneath the surface. Rebellions erupted and were crushed. Idealism gave way to necessity. Yet even in isolation, Napoleon understood narrative. He controlled information ruthlessly. Reports sent back to France emphasized victories, reforms, and discovery, while minimizing naval disaster. The image he projected was not of failure but of grandeur. Egypt, in his telling, was not a miscalculation. It was a civilizing mission. As months passed, Europe moved on without him. Coalitions shifted. The Directory faltered. France drifted toward crisis once more. Napoleon sensed the moment approaching. Egypt had taught him a final, crucial lesson, that conquest alone did not define power. Perception did. History, he realized, remembered those who shaped the story as much as those who won the battle. And so, in 1799, he prepared to leave. Not in triumph, but in silence. Napoleon's decision to remain in Egypt after the destruction of the fleet was not resignation. It was calculation. Cut off from France, he understood that survival depended on maintaining authority, momentum, and belief. The army could not be allowed to feel abandoned. The population could not be allowed to sense weakness. And history could not be allowed to record Egypt as a failure while he still had agency within it. He turned the expedition into a performance of power. In Cairo, Napoleon governed with an imperial confidence that contrasted sharply with the fragile authority of the Directory back home. He issued proclamations in careful language, framing French rule as restoration rather than occupation. He spoke of respecting Islamic customs, even as he enforced control through military tribunals and executions when resistance flared. When Cairo revolted in October 1798, French artillery shattered neighborhoods, and order was reimposed without apology. Napoleon drew the same conclusion he had learned in Paris. Disorder must be crushed swiftly, or it multiplies. Yet Egypt was not only about coercion, it was about imagination. The presence of the savants transformed the expedition into something unprecedented. Scholars mapped the Nile, catalogued flora and fauna, and documented monuments older than any European state. Ancient temples at Luxor and Karnak were measured and sketched with scientific rigor. For the first time, Egypt's past was studied systematically rather than plundered blindly. This fusion of conquest and knowledge served Napoleon's deeper ambition, to present himself not merely as a general, but as a founder of civilizations. The publication that would later emerge from this effort, the Description de l'Égypte, became one of the most ambitious scholarly works ever produced. Though Napoleon would not complete it himself, its origins were inseparable from his vision. Empire, he believed, should be intellectual as well as military. But the strategic reality remained unforgiving. British naval dominance tightened. Ottoman forces mobilized. France's enemies closed in from multiple directions. Napoleon attempted to preempt disaster by advancing north into Syria in early 1799, hoping to destabilize Ottoman power and secure Egypt's borders. The campaign was brutal and unforgiving. Disease ravaged the troops. Supply lines stretched thin. The siege of Acre, defended stubbornly with British naval support, stalled. For the first time since Italy, Napoleon met immovable resistance. Acre did not fall. The campaign faltered. Plague spread among the ranks. Casualties mounted. Napoleon withdrew to Egypt, his aura dented but not shattered. Even in retreat, he maintained discipline and concealment. Losses were minimized in official reports. Failures were reframed as strategic adjustments. He compensated with victory where he could. At Aboukir in July 1799, Napoleon defeated an Ottoman landing force decisively on land, restoring confidence within the army. The victory mattered less militarily than psychologically. It reinforced the belief that he remained capable of command despite isolation. But events in France now demanded his attention. The Directory was collapsing. Corruption was rampant. Military defeats mounted in Europe. Public confidence evaporated. From afar, Napoleon sensed the vacuum forming. He understood the pattern. When civil authority faltered, the nation turned to generals, and among them, his name still carried unmatched weight. Egypt had distanced him from France's political failures. He was not associated with the Directory's incompetence or decline. In absence, his reputation had matured rather than eroded. Newspapers continued to celebrate his earlier victories. The myth endured, even as reality in Egypt grew precarious. Napoleon made his decision quietly. In August 1799, he entrusted command in Egypt to General Kleber and departed secretly aboard a small fleet. The journey was dangerous. British ships patrolled the Mediterranean. Capture would have ended everything. But fortune favored him. He slipped through the blockade and landed in France in October. He returned not as a defeated commander, but as a savior arriving at the moment of national despair. The losses in Egypt were minimized. The naval disaster was softened. The scientific achievements were emphasized. Napoleon presented himself as a man who had carried French glory to the ancient world and returned with knowledge, prestige, and vision. France, exhausted and fearful, wanted to believe. Egypt had failed strategically, but it had succeeded mythically. Napoleon had learned how distance could insulate reputation, how narrative could outlive fact, and how absence could amplify authority. He had tested the idea of empire not as mere territory, but as identity, something constructed through symbols, achievements, and memory. As he stepped back onto French soil, the general was no longer merely a conqueror of armies. He was becoming a conqueror of history itself. Napoleon's return to France in the autumn of 1799 marked one of the most consequential moments of his life, not because of what he had achieved in Egypt, but because of how he had survived it. He arrived at a nation adrift. The Directory had lost credibility, authority, and public trust. Military setbacks in Europe had reignited fear. Economic hardship persisted. The revolution, once explosive with idealism, now staggered under the weight of its own contradictions. Napoleon stood apart from this decay. Egypt had insulated him from the failures of the regime. He had not presided over defeat in Italy or chaos in Paris. In the public imagination, he remained the victor of Rivoli, the conqueror of Italy, the general who had carried French arms to the land of pharaohs. The disasters at sea and in Syria were distant, abstract, softened by time and narrative. What remained was the image he carefully projected, disciplined, visionary, and untainted. This was Egypt's final and most enduring lesson. Napoleon had discovered that history does not record events neutrally. It records interpretations. Control the story and you shape memory. Egypt had been a strategic miscalculation, but it had expanded his stature beyond Europe. It framed him not merely as a soldier, but as an imperial figure, a man who bridged ancient civilization and modern ambition. The scientific achievements of the expedition reinforced this image. Scholars returned with drawings, measurements, and artifacts that captivated France's intellectual elite. Egyptomania swept through Paris. The ancient world, once distant and mysterious, now seemed accessible through French genius. Napoleon was credited as the architect of this cultural conquest, even as his army remained stranded. Behind the spectacle, he moved with intent. Napoleon read the political landscape with the same precision he had applied to battlefields. He saw a vacuum forming at the center of power. The Directory survived only through inertia and fear. France wanted order, it wanted stability, and it increasingly believed that only the army, led by a man of a proven success, could deliver it. Napoleon did not announce his ambitions. He allowed others to voice them for him. Politicians approached, officers aligned, alliances formed quietly. Napoleon presented himself not as a revolutionary radical, but as a restorer, someone who could preserve the revolution's gains while ending its chaos. This positioning was deliberate. He framed his authority as necessary, reluctant, and patriotic. Egypt had taught him patience. He had governed in isolation, balanced coercion and reform, and managed perception under extreme pressure. He had learned that power was as much about timing as force. To act too early invited destruction. To act when the nation was ready invited acceptance. The expedition had also expanded his sense of scale. Italy had shown him how to command armies. Egypt had shown him how to imagine empire, how to combine military dominance with cultural and intellectual ambition. It reinforced his belief that greatness required vision beyond borders, beyond institutions, beyond the present moment. Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt changed. He was more cautious, more theatrical, more aware of the symbolic dimensions of power. He no longer measured success solely in territory conquered, but in legitimacy accumulated. He understood that modern leadership required control of perception, not just cannon. The army remained his foundation, victory remained his currency, but now narrative became his shield. France stood at a crossroads, uncertain and weary. The revolution had dismantled the old order but failed to replace it with stability. Into this void stepped a man who promised both continuity and control, who claimed to protect the revolution by ending its excesses. Egypt had not delivered empire. It had delivered insight. And armed with that insight, Napoleon was ready for his most audacious campaign yet, not against foreign powers, but against the fragile machinery of the French state itself. Thus, from the sands of the ancient world, Napoleon returned not as a conqueror of Egypt, but as a man prepared to seize France. The battlefield was about to shift, from distant deserts to the heart of power itself. By the autumn of 1799, France was no longer aflame with revolutionary passion. It was smoldering with exhaustion. 10 years of upheaval had stripped the nation of certainty. Kings had fallen, committees had ruled, terror had consumed its architects, and victory abroad had failed to deliver peace at home. The ideals of 1789 remained etched into law. but the machinery meant to uphold them creaked under corruption, paralysis, and fear. The Directory governed in name, but scarcely in substance. Its 5 directors were divided, distrusted, and dependent on the army to suppress unrest. Elections were annulled when inconvenient. Finances were chaotic. Public confidence had evaporated. The state survived day to day, not through legitimacy, but through inertia. France had not rejected the revolution, but it had grown weary of being ruled by it. Into this atmosphere returned Napoleon Bonaparte. He arrived not with proclamations, but with timing. Italy had given him victory. Egypt had given him myth. Absence had given him distance from the regime's failures. To many French citizens, Napoleon represented something rare, success untainted by political scandal. He was not associated with bread shortages or corruption. He was associated with order. Napoleon understood the moment with surgical clarity. He did not denounce the revolution. He did not promise its reversal. Instead, he positioned himself as its protector, the man who would preserve its gains while ending its chaos. This distinction mattered. France did not want a return to monarchy. It wanted stability without surrendering equality. Napoleon spoke precisely to that desire. Behind the scenes, alliances formed quickly. Senior politicians, among them Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, recognized that the Directory could not survive. Sieyès had long believed that the revolution required a strong executive to endure. Napoleon offered something Sieyès lacked: popular legitimacy and the loyalty of soldiers. Their partnership was pragmatic, not ideological. Each needed the other. The plan that emerged was cautious in appearance and decisive in effect. On 18 Brumaire, year the 7th of the revolutionary calendar, November 9th, 1799, the Council of Ancients, citing vague threats to the Republic, transferred legislative bodies from Paris to the suburb of St. Cloud. The movement was framed as precaution. In reality, it removed lawmakers from the volatile streets and placed them within reach of military influence. Napoleon was appointed commander of the troops tasked with protecting the councils. It was the critical step. From the outset, the coup unfolded not as a dramatic seizure, but as a procedural unraveling. There were no barricades, no public executions, no mass arrests. Instead, authority dissolved quietly. Directors resigned or were sidelined. Confusion spread among legislators. Debates stalled. Napoleon entered the chamber not as a conqueror, but as a guarantor of order. Yet even he misjudged the moment. When he attempted to address the Council of 500 directly, he was met with hostility. Deputies shouted accusations of treason. Some rushed toward him physically. The scene teetered on collapse. For a brief moment, the coup faltered, not because of force, but because of legitimacy. Napoleon retreated. It was his brother Lucien, president of the council, who intervened, declaring that violent deputies threatened the Republic and calling on troops to restore order. Soldiers entered the chamber. The assembly dispersed. Authority evaporated. By nightfall, the Directory was finished. In its place emerged the consulate, a new executive structure composed of 3 consuls. On paper, it appeared balanced. In reality, it was not. Napoleon was named First Consul, holding the real power to propose laws, control the army, and direct the state. The transition was swift and remarkably bloodless. France did not rise in protest. There were no widespread uprisings, no royalist counter-revolution, no Jacobin resurgence. Instead, there was silence, and then relief. Napoleon recognized this reaction as validation. The revolution had promised liberty, but delivered uncertainty. The coup promised order, and order, in a nation exhausted by chaos, felt like salvation. People accepted the new regime not because they were coerced, but because they were tired. Napoleon did not present himself as a dictator. He spoke of unity, reconciliation, and efficiency. He preserved revolutionary principles: equality before the law, careers open to talent, secular governance, while stripping away ideological excess. The language of revolution remained, but its volatility was removed. This was not an abandonment of the revolution. It was its inheritance. Napoleon Bonaparte had crossed the threshold from general to ruler, not through conquest, but through consent shaped by necessity. He had not seized France in the name of ambition. He had stepped into a vacuum history itself had created. And as the consulate took form, one truth became increasingly clear. France had not escaped the revolution. It had simply placed it under new management. Once installed as first consul, Napoleon moved with controlled urgency. The coup had dismantled the old structure, but it had not yet built a new one capable of enduring. France did not need slogans, it needed function. Napoleon understood that legitimacy, once acquired, had to be reinforced immediately through results. Delay would invite resistance, efficiency would silence doubt. His first objective was consolidation. The consulate was presented as collective leadership, but decision-making flowed unmistakably toward him. The other consuls, Cambaceres and Lebrun, were competent administrators, chosen precisely because they posed no rival center of gravity. Napoleon listened to advice, encouraged debate, and then decided alone. Authority was centralized without spectacle, wrapped in procedure and legality. He turned first to administration. France had been fractured by years of revolutionary improvisation. Departments operated unevenly. Local officials answered to shifting authorities. Corruption flourished in ambiguity. Napoleon replaced this disorder with hierarchy. Prefects were appointed to govern departments, responsible directly to the central government. For the first time since 1789, France possessed a coherent administrative spine. Orders could be issued, enforced, and verified. This reform was revolutionary in its own way. It preserved the revolution's destruction of feudal privilege while restoring the state's capacity to act. Local power was no longer inherited or ideological. It was appointed, supervised, and accountable. Napoleon did not trust spontaneity, he trusted systems. Next came finance. Years of war and mismanagement had hollowed out the treasury. Inflation eroded confidence. Credit was unreliable. Napoleon stabilized the currency, reformed taxation, and restored fiscal discipline. The creation of the Bank of France in 1800 anchored the economy, linking state authority with financial credibility. Confidence returned gradually, not through rhetoric, but through predictability. The public noticed. Markets stabilized. Pay arrived more regularly. Administration functioned. Roads were repaired. Order, once absent, became visible. For a population exhausted by ideological oscillation, these changes mattered more than abstract liberty. Napoleon understood that people judge regimes not by their intentions, but by their outcomes. He moved carefully on sensitive ground. Religion, suppressed aggressively during the Revolution, remained a source of tension. Napoleon did not share clerical devotion, but he understood social reality. In 1801, he negotiated the Concordat with the Catholic Church, restoring religious practice while subordinating it to state authority. Priests were paid by the government. Loyalty flowed upward. Faith returned, but under regulation. This balance was deliberate. Napoleon did not restore the old alliance between throne and altar. He repurposed religion as a stabilizing force within a secular state. Ideology yielded to pragmatism. Reconciliation replaced persecution. Throughout these reforms, Napoleon maintained a careful narrative. He framed every change as preservation, not reversal. The revolution's core principles, legal equality, property rights, merit, were not only retained, but codified. The civil code, though not yet completed, began to take shape in his mind as the ultimate expression of rational order. Law would no longer fluctuate with political mood. It would endure. Opposition existed, but it lacked momentum. Royalists hoped for restoration. Jacobins feared betrayal, but neither could mobilize effectively. The army supported Napoleon. The bureaucracy functioned under him. The public tolerated him, then approved him. Plebiscites confirmed his authority by overwhelming margins, whether through genuine support, controlled processes, or both. Legitimacy was constructed methodically. Napoleon did not rule through terror. He ruled through relief. People felt that the revolution's violence had ended, that someone was finally in control, that tomorrow might resemble today rather than contradict it. This psychological shift was as important as any law or decree. Behind the scenes, Napoleon refined his understanding of power further. He saw that political authority required constant motion, not dramatic upheaval, but visible progress. Each reform reinforced the next. Administration strengthened finance. Finance sustained the army protected the state. The system closed in on itself, stable and self-reinforcing. The general who had once mastered battlefields was now mastering institutions. And yet, he never forgot the origin of his authority. The consulate rested on force, even if it rarely displayed it. Napoleon ensured the army remained loyal, well-paid, and honored. He visited units personally. He rewarded competence. He understood that civilian order endured only so long as military confidence held. France, for the first time in a decade, felt governed rather than convulsed. The revolution had promised a new world. Napoleon was delivering one, quietly, efficiently, and under his direction. But even as stability returned, a question lingered beneath the calm. Was this the culmination of the revolution or merely its next transformation? By 1801, the shape of France had changed decisively. The chaos that once defined revolutionary life had receded, replaced by a state that functioned with unprecedented coherence. Laws were enforced uniformly, finances stabilized, religious conflict softened into accommodation. The machinery of government no longer lurched from crisis to crisis. It moved with purpose. And at the center of it all stood Napoleon Bonaparte. The consulate had succeeded where every previous revolutionary government had failed. It had restored order without openly rejecting the revolution's ideals. This balance was not accidental. Napoleon had learned through years of war and instability that revolutions collapse when they devour their own foundations. Preservation, not purity, was the key to endurance. He governed as a realist. The new constitution concentrated power in the executive, but cloaked authority in legality. Elections existed, but their outcomes were managed. Institutions remained, but their independence was limited. Napoleon believed liberty required structure, and that structure required control. He did not abolish the revolution. He disciplined it. Public response reflected this pragmatism. France accepted his rule not through fear alone, but through relief. After a decade of unpredictability, people welcomed consistency. They could plan again, invest again, believe again that tomorrow would resemble today. Napoleon understood that stability was its own form of legitimacy. The army remained his foundation. Though no longer constantly at war, it stood as the ultimate guarantor of the state. Napoleon ensured it remained loyal through pay, promotion, and prestige. Careers advanced by merit. Soldiers saw in him a leader who rewarded competence, not birth. The revolution's promise of equality lived most clearly within the ranks of the army. At the same time, Napoleon neutralized opposition with restraint rather than terror. Censorship was imposed quietly. Dissent was monitored. Threats were isolated rather than broadcast. He understood that fear, when overused, provoked resistance. Order, when normalized, went unquestioned. The coup of 18 Brumaire revealed Napoleon's mastery of timing. He had not seized power in a moment of national fervor, but in a moment of fatigue. France did not rise against him because it did not want to rise anymore. The revolution had burned through enthusiasm, and left behind longing for stability. Napoleon stepped into that emotional vacuum with precision. In doing so, he completed a transformation years in the making. The Corsican outsider had become France's ruler not through divine right, but through performance. He had mastered the battlefield, then the narrative, and finally the state. Each phase prepared him for the next. Each victory reinforced the belief that authority followed success. Yet even as first consul, Napoleon did not consider his work complete. Stability, he believed, had to be protected from time, opposition, and uncertainty. The revolution had shown how fragile systems could be. He intended to build something stronger, something permanent. That ambition would soon push him beyond the limits of republican restraint. France had accepted his leadership. The revolution had found its heir. What remained was to decide what form that inheritance would take. And as order settled over France, Napoleon Bonaparte began to consider not merely how to govern a republic, but how to ensure that his authority would endure beyond crisis, beyond opposition, and beyond himself. The general had seized the state. The ruler was about to reshape it. In the calm that followed revolution and coup, Napoleon Bonaparte turned his attention to a different battlefield, one without cannon smoke or marching columns. France had been stabilized, but stability alone was fragile. Regimes built on emergency could collapse as quickly as they rose. Napoleon understood that if his authority were to endure, it had to be embedded not only in armies, but in institutions. Power needed permanence, and permanence required law. The revolution had destroyed the old legal order with remarkable speed. Feudal privileges were abolished, noble courts dissolved, regional customs swept aside. Yet what replaced them was uneven and unstable. Laws varied from province to province, often contradictory, frequently unclear. Justice depended on geography as much as principle. Equality had been declared, but not yet systematized. Napoleon resolved to change that. He believed that societies endured not through ideals alone, but through clear rules applied consistently. Law, to him, was not an abstract moral exercise. It was an instrument of order, and order, once established, justified authority. From this conviction emerged his most lasting achievement, the Civil Code, later known as the Napoleonic Code. Work on the code began under the consulate, guided by jurists but driven relentlessly by Napoleon himself. He attended sessions personally, questioning clauses, challenging assumptions, and demanding clarity. The code aimed to do something unprecedented: unify French law into a single, rational system accessible to all citizens. Gone were feudal privileges, hereditary exemptions, and arbitrary judgments. In their place stood principles revolutionary in their simplicity: equality before the law, protection of property, freedom of contract, and secular authority. For many French citizens, this was the revolution finally made tangible. The law no longer belonged to tradition or class. It belonged to the state, and by extension to the people as individuals rather than estates. Careers remained open to talent. Property seized during the revolution was secured. Social mobility became legally protected. In this sense, Napoleon preserved the revolution's core achievements more effectively than any assembly had managed. Yet the code also revealed his limitations. Equality before the law did not mean equality in practice. Women were subordinated to male authority within the family. Workers were restricted in their ability to organize. The state retained sweeping powers of enforcement. Liberty was defined narrowly, always balanced against order. Napoleon did not believe freedom should threaten stability. Rights existed, but within boundaries set by the state. This philosophy extended beyond law into governance. Napoleon restructured education to serve national purpose. Secondary schools, lycées, were established to train administrators, officers, and professionals loyal to the state. Curriculum emphasized discipline, mathematics, and history, subjects that produced function, not dissent. Education became a pipeline for merit but also for conformity. Talent was rewarded, but independence of thought was not encouraged. At the same time, Napoleon strengthened the financial foundations of France. The creation of the Bank of France stabilized credit and anchored economic confidence. Taxes were collected more efficiently. Budgets were enforced with discipline. The state, for the first time in years, could plan beyond immediate crisis. Predictability replaced improvisation. Religion, too, was reorganized. Napoleon had no interest in restoring clerical dominance, but he recognized religion's social power. The Concordat of 1801 reconciled France with the Catholic Church, allowing public worship to resume while placing clergy under state authority. Bishops were appointed by the government. Loyalty flowed upward. Faith returned, but under regulation. To Napoleon, this was not compromise. It was integration. Each reform followed the same logic: absorb forces that once challenged the state, reorganize them under central control, and convert potential opposition into stability. The result was a France more unified, more efficient, and more governable than it had been for generations. But this efficiency came at a cost. Centralization accelerated, local autonomy faded, political pluralism narrowed, institutions functioned smoothly. But they functioned through Napoleon. His will set direction, his judgment resolved disputes, his presence anchored the system. France was becoming modern, and it was becoming dependent. The builder behind the conqueror was now fully visible, a man convinced that rational order could redeem revolutionary chaos, and that society, properly structured, could be perfected. The question that lingered beneath these achievements was not whether Napoleon had strengthened France. It was whether France could ever function without him. As Napoleon's reforms took root, their cumulative effect reshaped France at every level of daily life. What had once been a nation governed by improvisation and emergency now operated with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost mechanical. Orders flowed downward, reports flowed upward. The state began to function not as a forum for debate, but as an instrument for execution. Napoleon insisted on clarity above all else. In administration, ambiguity was treated as a weakness. Prefects, the linchpins of his centralized system, were selected not for popularity, but for obedience and competence. They represented the state in every department, enforcing laws uniformly, supervising local officials, and reporting directly to Paris. Regional identities, once politically potent, were neutralized by consistency. The state was no longer negotiated with, it was experienced. This uniformity was revolutionary in its own way. For the first time, a farmer in Provence and a merchant in Normandy encountered the same laws, the same courts, and the same administrative expectations. Justice became predictable. Authority became visible. The Revolution's promise of equality before the law found its most concrete expression here, not in assemblies, but in procedure. Napoleon believed predictability created loyalty. Citizens did not need to love the state, he reasoned. They needed to trust it would behave the same tomorrow as it did today. Stability, once normalized, discouraged resistance. Disorder, once removed, lost its appeal. The Civil Code spread this logic across Europe as French influence expanded. Wherever Napoleon's armies went, the code followed, sometimes imposed, sometimes adopted voluntarily. It dismantled feudal structures, standardized contracts, and clarified property rights. Even enemies would later retain its principles. Long after Napoleon himself fell, his laws endured, shaping legal systems from Italy to Germany and beyond. Yet these reforms were inseparable from control. Napoleon did not believe in unrestricted political freedom. He had watched assemblies paralyze the state and factions tear it apart. Debate, in his view, was useful only until decisions were required. Once made, decisions had to be enforced. Opposition was tolerated only so long as it did not threaten cohesion. Censorship tightened quietly. Newspapers were reduced in number and placed under supervision. Political clubs were dissolved or monitored. Criticism was not eliminated, but it was contained. Napoleon preferred silence to spectacle, compliance to confrontation. He had learned that overt repression created martyrs, while administrative pressure created obedience. Education reflected the same philosophy. The lycée produced engineers, jurists, and officers, individuals trained to serve the state efficiently. Advancement was based on merit, but merit was defined by usefulness. Napoleon was proud of this system. It rewarded talent regardless of birth, fulfilling one of the revolution's core promises. But it also molded talent toward loyalty. Education became a mechanism of continuity, ensuring that future elites would think in structured, disciplined terms. Religion, once a source of civil war, was now regulated into predictability. The Concordat stabilized spiritual life without empowering clerical independence. Napoleon attended religious ceremonies selectively, projecting respect without submission. Faith, like law, was permitted but subordinated. All these reforms reinforced one another. Administration enabled law. Law stabilized finance. Finance sustained the army. The army protected the state. The system functioned because each component depended on the others, and all ultimately depended on Napoleon's authority. This interdependence was both strength and vulnerability. Napoleon was tireless. He worked relentlessly, reading reports late into the night, dictating letters at dawn, personally reviewing legal clauses and military deployments. His energy animated the system. His attention resolved disputes. His presence accelerated decisions. But the system did not operate independently of him. He was the arbiter, the final authority, the point where all lines converged. The more efficient France became, the more it relied on his judgment. Institutions grew stronger, but autonomy diminished. The state gained coherence, but flexibility narrowed. Napoleon was aware of this tension and accepted it. He believed that history demanded concentration of power during periods of transformation. Freedom, he argued implicitly, was meaningless without order. Order, once established, could later accommodate liberty, but disorder, once unleashed, destroyed both. This belief guided every reform. France under Napoleon was modern, disciplined, and rational. It was also increasingly hierarchical, centralized, and dependent on a single will. The revolution's ideals had been preserved, but their volatility had been neutralized. Citizens noticed the difference. Life felt calmer. Courts functioned, commerce resumed, travel became safer. For many, these tangible improvements outweighed abstract concerns about political participation. Napoleon understood that people measure governance by outcomes, not theories. And so, his authority deepened, not through fear alone, but through habit. Order became normal. Efficiency became expected. Control became invisible. Yet beneath this calm, a question persisted. Quiet, unresolved, and increasingly significant. Could a system so tightly bound to one man endure beyond him? Napoleon was building something that looked permanent, but permanence, he knew, required more than law and administration. It required legitimacy that could survive uncertainty, opposition, and time. As France adjusted to its new rhythm, Napoleon began to think beyond reform. Stability had been achieved. Now it had to be secured. By the early years of the new century, the transformation of France was undeniable. The revolution's violence had receded into memory, replaced by a state that functioned with precision and authority. Courts ruled consistently. Administrators enforced policy uniformly. Finances stabilized. Religion returned without dominating politics. Education produced disciplined elites. France no longer lurched from crisis to crisis. It advanced along a controlled path. Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved what no revolutionary government before him had managed. He had made power durable. The civil code stood at the center of this achievement. It did more than unify laws. It unified expectations. Citizens knew where they stood in relation to the state. Property was protected. Contracts were enforceable. Equality before the law, once a slogan, became routine. In time, this code would outlive Napoleon himself, embedded across Europe and beyond, shaping modern legal systems long after his fall. Yet the code also revealed the philosophy that defined his rule. Napoleon did not see liberty as an unlimited right. He saw it as a condition permitted by order. Rights existed, but they were structured, regulated, and enforced from above. The state did not merely guarantee freedom, it defined its boundaries. For Napoleon, this was not tyranny, it was rational governance. This conviction shaped every reform. Administration became hierarchical, education became instrumental, religion became regulated, the press became restrained. Opposition became manageable rather than annihilated. The state no longer relied on terror, but it did not tolerate unpredictability. Napoleon had replaced revolutionary volatility with administrative certainty. France responded positively, not with enthusiasm but with acceptance. After years of upheaval, predictability felt like progress. Citizens adjusted quickly to the new normal. Obedience became habitual. Stability became invisible. And that invisibility was itself a form of power. Yet within this success lay a growing dependence. The system functioned because Napoleon functioned. His energy sustained it. His judgment coordinated it. His presence resolved conflicts before they escalated. The more efficient France became, the more it relied on his continuous attention. Napoleon recognized this and did not retreat from it. He believed history rewarded builders willing to shoulder responsibility without hesitation. The revolution, he concluded, had failed not because its ideals were flawed, but because its leaders lacked discipline. He intended to correct that failure permanently. But permanence required legitimacy beyond administration. Laws could unify a nation. Institutions could stabilize it. But authority that endured across generations required something more enduring than efficiency. It required symbolism, continuity, a sense of inevitability. Napoleon began to think in these terms. The consulate had restored order, but it remained provisional. Its authority rested on plebiscites and performance. What would happen if success faltered, if uncertainty returned? Napoleon had learned, through revolution and war, how quickly legitimacy could evaporate. He did not intend to let that happen. France was modern now, disciplined, rational, centralized, but it was also increasingly shaped by a single will. The builder behind the conqueror had constructed a state capable of sustaining power. The question that now confronted him was not whether he could govern France. It was whether France could ever be allowed to govern without him. Law had given structure. Order had given peace. Reform had given strength. What remained was to give authority a form that could not be challenged by crisis or fatigue. A form that would anchor stability beyond personality, beyond contingency. As Napoleon surveyed the nation he had reshaped, one truth stood clear. The revolution had destroyed the old foundations of legitimacy. Someone would have to replace them, and Napoleon Bonaparte was already preparing to do so. For once law has disciplined chaos, and order has silenced revolution. Power no longer asks whether it should endure, only how. By 1804, the silence of revolution had given way to the hum of administration, and the hum of administration to a deeper question. one Napoleon Bonaparte could no longer postpone. France was stable, its laws were unified, its finances steadied, its borders for the moment secure. Yet beneath this order lay a fragility Napoleon understood all too well. Legitimacy rooted solely in performance could vanish with a single crisis. The consulate had restored France, but it was provisional by design. Napoleon had risen through necessity, accepted through relief, and sustained through results. But history had taught him that republics born of revolution struggled to endure without symbols of continuity. The old monarchy had fallen not only because it was unjust, but because it had lost authority. Napoleon intended to ensure that his regime would not suffer the same fate. The solution he conceived was audacious and revealing. He would crown himself emperor, not in defiance of the revolution, but as its culmination. On December 2, 1804, in the vast interior of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte transformed himself from first consul into Emperor of the French. The ceremony was steeped in calculated symbolism. Pope Pius VII was present but relegated. When the moment came, Napoleon took the crown from the altar and placed it on his own head. The gesture was unmistakable. Authority, he declared without words, did not descend from God. It rose from achievement, from victory, from order imposed upon chaos. He was not crowned by divine right or ancient lineage, but by his own hand, before a nation that had accepted his rule. Europe watched in disbelief. For monarchies already unnerved by revolutionary France, this was confirmation of their worst fears. The revolution had not been contained, it had evolved. A general had seized a crown, forged not through bloodline, but through war. The old order shuddered at the precedent. If authority could be manufactured, then no throne was secure. Within France, the reaction was more subdued and more telling. There was no uprising, no mass resistance. The empire was accepted with weary approval. After years of instability, the promise of continuity mattered more than republican purity. Napoleon framed the empire not as a return to monarchy, but as its rational successor. Titles returned, but privilege did not. Nobility was granted for service, not birth. The revolution's destruction of feudal hierarchy remained intact, even as a new hierarchy emerged. Napoleon believed that people desired not freedom alone, but certainty. The empire provided it. With the crown came a shift in ambition. Napoleon no longer spoke only of governance. He spoke of legacy. Dynastic continuity became central to his vision. He placed siblings and relatives on the thrones of conquered territories, weaving a web of family rule across Europe. Loyalty, he believed, was strongest when reinforced by blood. Yet this transformation carried an unspoken cost. An emperor could not afford stagnation. Republican legitimacy could survive peace. Imperial legitimacy could not. Empire demanded expansion, or at least the perception of strength. Napoleon understood this instinctively. His authority now rested not only on administration, but on dominance. Victory was no longer merely useful, it was essential. War became the empire's lifeblood. The Grande Armée expanded and professionalized. Campaigns grew larger, faster, more ambitious. Napoleon's confidence, sharpened by years of success, hardened into certainty. He believed history rewarded strength and punished hesitation. Caution, he felt, was the language of decline. And yet, even at the height of his power, the contradiction remained. By crowning himself, Napoleon had anchored legitimacy to conquest. Peace, once the goal of reform, now carried danger. Without external threats and victories, the empire's purpose would be questioned. Authority built on motion could not stand still. The coronation was both culmination and commitment. It sealed Napoleon's transformation from revolutionary general to imperial ruler. It stabilized France and unsettled Europe. It promised permanence but demanded momentum. From this moment forward, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer merely defending the revolution's gains. He was defending his crown. And crowns, once claimed, must be justified again and again on the battlefield. The proclamation of empire altered the geometry of European power overnight. What had once been a republic exporting revolution was now an empire exporting authority. Napoleon understood this shift instinctively. By taking the crown, he had declared that France was no longer experimenting with governance. It was asserting permanence, and permanence, in Europe's long memory, had always been enforced through dominance. The crowned emperor moved quickly to secure what symbolism alone could not. He restructured the state to reflect imperial hierarchy. The Senate became a ceremonial body. Ministries answered directly to him. Honors, titles, and decorations, most notably the Legion of Honor, bound elites to his regime through prestige rather than ideology. Loyalty was rewarded visibly. Service replaced birth as the pathway to status, yet status itself returned as a stabilizing force. Napoleon believed hierarchy was inevitable. The revolution had destroyed the old one, but human societies, he believed, required structure to function. His empire would provide that structure, rational, merit-based, and centrally controlled. In this sense, the empire was not a rejection of 1789, but its disciplined continuation. Europe did not share this interpretation. Britain, already at war with France, viewed the coronation as confirmation that Napoleon sought continental domination. Austria and Russia watched warily, understanding that an emperor forged in revolution could not be appeased by treaties alone. Coalitions began to reform, diplomacy hardened. The continent moved once again toward large-scale war. Napoleon welcomed the challenge. He believed conflict clarified power relations and eliminated uncertainty. War, to him, was not chaos. It was resolution. Each campaign tested the strength of his system, and each victory reinforced his authority at home. The empire, newly crowned, needed demonstration. In 1805, the test arrived. As the Third Coalition mobilized against France, Napoleon responded with speed that stunned Europe. The Grande Armée crossed the Rhine, enveloped Austrian forces at Ulm, and marched toward the heart of Central Europe. His movements were fluid, coordinated, and relentless. Old dynastic armies struggled to keep pace. At Austerlitz, Napoleon delivered one of the most decisive victories in military history. Outnumbered, he lured Allied forces into a trap, then shattered them through precision and timing. The Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had endured for 1,000 years, collapsed soon after. Europe's old order cracked visibly. The victory validated the empire. Within France, admiration deepened into awe. Napoleon appeared invincible, an emperor who did not merely inherit power, but earned it repeatedly. His authority felt justified not by tradition, but by success. The crown seemed less an act of ambition than an acknowledgment of reality. Yet with each triumph, the empire's logic tightened. Napoleon placed brothers and relatives on newly created thrones, Joseph in Naples, Louis in Holland, later others across Europe. He believed family loyalty could stabilize conquest, but blood ties did not guarantee competence or acceptance. Resistance simmered beneath imposed rule. National identities, awakened by French domination, hardened rather than dissolved. Napoleon underestimated this force. He believed administrative efficiency could override cultural resistance. He believed populations preferred rational governance to inherited privilege. In some regions, this proved true. In others, it bred resentment. Empire spread not only French law and order, but also opposition. Still, Napoleon pressed forward. He viewed hesitation as weakness. Each year, without decisive action, he believed, gave enemies time to regroup. Peace, in his mind, was not neutral. It was dangerous. Without external pressure, internal questioning would emerge. Authority anchored to victory required continued motion. Thus, the empire accelerated. Military commitments multiplied. Frontiers expanded. The system strained to sustain momentum. Yet Napoleon's confidence remained absolute. He trusted his judgment. He trusted his army. He trusted the logic that had carried him from obscurity to empire. What he did not fully confront was the cost of perpetual dominance. The empire demanded constant mobilization of men, resources, and attention. It required victory not occasionally, but continuously. One failure could unravel the narrative that sustained authority. One miscalculation could expose the fragility beneath grandeur. The crown he had placed upon his own head was secure only so long as the world acknowledged his strength. And strength in Europe's unforgiving balance was never permanent. As the empire reached its zenith, Napoleon Bonaparte stood unmatched, confident, commanding, and convinced that history rewarded those who moved boldly and punished those who paused. But in binding legitimacy to conquest, he had bound his fate to war. And war, unlike ceremony, offers no guarantees. By the mid-years of his reign, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the summit of power unprecedented in modern Europe. His empire stretched across the continent, his armies undefeated in decisive battle, his authority unchallenged within France. The crown he had placed upon his own head no longer appeared symbolic. It seemed inevitable. Yet this inevitability masked a profound vulnerability. Napoleon had transformed legitimacy into a function of dominance. He ruled not by tradition or divine sanction, but by demonstrated superiority. Each victory reinforced his right to rule. Each defeat threatened to undermine it. This was the paradox of his empire. Its strength lay in motion, and its weakness lay in stillness. Peace became dangerous. Without war, the empire's purpose blurred. The army, the engine of legitimacy, required employment. The elite, bound by honors and conquest, required expansion. And Napoleon himself, shaped by decades of decisive action, distrusted equilibrium. He believed history punished hesitation more severely than risk. Europe, meanwhile, adapted. Monarchies learned from defeat. They reformed their armies, studied Napoleon's methods, and waited. Britain remained unconquered, its navy unbroken. The continental blockade Napoleon imposed strained economies and bred quiet resistance. Occupied territories, governed by Napoleon's relatives and administrators, grew restless. National identities, once suppressed, strengthened under foreign rule. The empire's structure, so rational in theory, proved fragile in practice. Family members placed on thrones lacked Napoleon's discipline and authority. Local elites complied outwardly while resisting inwardly. Administration functioned, but loyalty wavered. Empire spread law and order, but also resentment. Napoleon remained confident. He believed that efficiency could override identity, that prosperity could replace allegiance, that victory could resolve dissent. These assumptions had served him well, until they began to collide with realities he could not fully control. By crowning himself, Napoleon had crossed a threshold beyond which retreat was impossible. He could no longer govern as first consul, balancing reform and restraint. He was emperor now. His authority demanded spectacle, hierarchy, and demonstration. Each year without triumph invited doubt. Each treaty without submission felt incomplete. This was the cost of self-coronation. The empire's legitimacy rested not on continuity, but on conquest. The revolution's energy had been transformed into imperial ambition, but ambition required constant fuel, and the fuel was war. Napoleon did not fear this necessity. He embraced it. He believed his system, administrative, military, legal, was superior. He believed history favored those who acted decisively. He believed that one great mind, properly positioned, could shape the fate of nations. For a time, he was correct. The empire functioned, Europe trembled, France prospered, the crown remained secure. But beneath the confidence lay an unspoken truth. No system built on perpetual expansion can rest indefinitely. No ruler, however brilliant, can outrun consequence forever. The coronation of 1804 had crowned Napoleon emperor. It had also crowned war as the foundation of his rule. And from that moment forward, every campaign carried not only strategic stakes, but existential ones. For if the empire stopped advancing, it would begin to unravel. Thus, at the height of his power, Napoleon Bonaparte bound his destiny to conquest, and in doing so, set the terms of his own trial by history. The crown was secure. The future was not. In the winter of 1805, Europe stood beneath the shadow of a single will. The crowned emperor of France had not merely survived coalition after coalition, he had redefined what power looked like on the continent. Monarchies that had ruled for centuries now measured their security against the speed of Napoleon's marches. Borders shifted not through diplomacy, but through movement. Treaties followed battles, and the rhythm of Europe increasingly followed the cadence of the Grande Armée. The Third Coalition had assembled with confidence. Austria, Russia, Britain, each believed that France, overstretched and newly imperial, could be checked. Napoleon responded not with defense, but with acceleration. He drew enemy forces inward, invited overconfidence, and then shattered it with precision. At Austerlitz on December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon delivered a victory so complete that it entered history as legend. Outnumbered, he feigned weakness, lured the Allied armies into abandoning strong ground, then struck at their exposed center. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. The myth of coalition superiority collapsed in a single morning fog. The consequences were seismic. The Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had endured for nearly a millennium, ceased to exist. Austria retreated from German affairs. France became the dominant continental power. Napoleon did not merely defeat enemies, he dismantled systems. Yet Austerlitz was not an endpoint. It was a confirmation. Napoleon believed that Europe could be reorganized rationally, freed from dynastic stagnation and bound by modern administration. He dissolved ancient principalities, merged territories, and imposed new political structures aligned with French interests. The Confederation of the Rhine replaced imperial fragmentation with centralized control. Old allegiances crumbled. New loyalties were demanded. But reorganization from above carried consequences. At Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, Napoleon destroyed the Prussian army in a matter of weeks. The speed of collapse stunned Europe. Prussia, long considered a military power, was humiliated. Berlin fell. The old Prussian order, rigid, aristocratic, self-assured, was exposed as obsolete. Once again, Napoleon's system appeared unstoppable. Yet beneath the victories, a subtle shift began. France no longer appeared as a liberator to all. The rhetoric of revolution, of emancipation and equality, rang hollow beneath occupation, taxation, and conscription. What had begun as reform increasingly felt like domination. National pride, once suppressed under dynasties, awakened under foreign rule. Napoleon sensed resistance, but dismissed its depth. He believed that administrative efficiency could override sentiment, that prosperity would follow order, that people would accept foreign authority if it functioned better than the old. In some regions, this proved true. In others, it planted the seeds of defiance. Britain remained beyond his grasp. Unable to defeat the Royal Navy, Napoleon turned to economic warfare. The continental system was designed to strangle British trade by closing European ports to its goods. In theory, it would weaken Britain without battle. In practice, it strained Europe itself. Smuggling flourished, merchants suffered, allies resented enforcement. The empire demanded sacrifice without offering participation. Victory had unified Europe under French influence, but not under shared belief. By 1809, war returned again. Austria rose once more, driven by humiliation and renewed resolve. At Wagram, Napoleon prevailed, but at a cost that signaled change. The battle was vast, brutal, and indecisive in spirit if not outcome. France won, but not cleanly. Losses mounted, momentum slowed. Napoleon stood at the center of a vast system held together by success. Each campaign reinforced control, but also dependence. Each reform imposed from Paris weakened local loyalty. Each victory demanded another. Europe was under pressure, reshaped, reordered, but increasingly restless. The empire still moved forward. But the strain was beginning to show. As the empire expanded, its contradictions deepened. Napoleon's system had been designed for motion, rapid campaigns, decisive battles, swift reorganization. But Europe was not an empty map. It was a continent layered with language, memory, religion, and identity. What could be conquered quickly could not always be reconciled easily. The more Napoleon won, the more he governed unwilling peoples. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in Spain. In 1808, Napoleon intervened in Iberian politics with the confidence of a man accustomed to compliance. He deposed the Spanish Bourbon king and installed his brother Joseph on the throne, believing administrative reform and dynastic legitimacy would suffice. Instead, Spain erupted. What followed was not a conventional war, but something Napoleon had never fully confronted. Popular resistance, guerrilla warfare spread across the countryside, ambushes, assassinations, sabotage. French supply lines were harassed relentlessly. Control of cities did not translate into control of the land. The army that had mastered open battlefields struggled against an enemy without uniforms, formations, or fixed positions. The Peninsular War became a slow hemorrhage. British forces, led by Arthur Wellesley, exploited the chaos, turning Spain into a permanent front. Troops that might have been used elsewhere were consumed by attrition. Victory was never decisive. Every town taken required garrisons. Every road required protection. The empire's momentum slowed, not through defeat, but through exhaustion. Napoleon had underestimated nationalism. In Germany, reforms imposed under French influence had initially been welcomed by some intellectuals and reformers. But as conscription increased and resources flowed toward Paris, enthusiasm faded. Prussia, humiliated at Jena, underwent profound reform, modernizing its army, administration, and education with one goal in mind: recovery. Napoleon had defeated it militarily, but in doing so, he had forced it to adapt. Russia posed an even greater challenge. Bound by treaty after defeat, Russia complied outwardly with the continental system while quietly undermining it. Its vast economy depended on trade. Its elites resented French dominance. Its court grew wary of an emperor who reshaped Europe without consultation. The alliance frayed not through open conflict, but through mutual suspicion. Napoleon responded as he always had, by tightening control. He enforced the continental system more harshly, pressuring allies and annexing territories to ensure compliance. Ports were closed, trade was policed, customs officials became instruments of empire. But economic warfare cut both ways. European economies suffered. Smuggling became endemic. Discontent spread among merchants, farmers, and officials alike. The empire's legitimacy eroded quietly. Napoleon still won battles. His armies remained formidable. His strategic mind was unmatched, but war was no longer producing clean solutions. Each victory resolved one problem while creating another. The empire grew faster than it could stabilize. Administration followed conquest, but always a step behind. At the center of it all, Napoleon worked relentlessly. He traveled constantly, issuing orders, revising plans, responding to crises across a continent. His energy seemed inexhaustible, but the system required it. There was no pause, no equilibrium. Peace would expose fractures. Only motion held the empire together. The cost of this pressure was measured not only in casualties, but in loyalty. Allies became reluctant. Populations grew resentful. Even within France, the burden of conscription and taxation increased. The revolutionary promise of liberation had been replaced by imperial obligation. People complied, but enthusiasm waned. Napoleon believed this was temporary. He assumed that one final consolidation, one decisive realignment of Europe, would secure lasting order. He had always believed that instability was transitional, that history moved toward clarity through force. What he did not fully accept was that force alone could not manufacture consent indefinitely. Between 1805 and 1811, Europe was unified under French influence, but not reconciled. The emperor's brilliance had reshaped the map, but not the hearts of those who lived upon it. The system functioned, but it functioned under strain, held together by fear, momentum, and the expectation of continued victory. Napoleon remained at its center, confident, commanding, and increasingly isolated by his own success. The empire had reached its greatest extent. What remained was to decide whether it could endure without constant expansion or whether one final test would determine its fate. By 1811, the Napoleonic Empire had reached a scale no European power had achieved in generations. From the Atlantic coast to the frontiers of Poland, French influence dictated law, trade, and war. On maps, Europe appeared unified, redrawn under a single strategic logic. In reality, it was a continent compressed under pressure. Napoleon stood at the center of this system like a keystone. Remove him, and the structure would collapse on them. Yet the very need for his constant presence revealed the empire's fragility. Military supremacy remained intact, but political sustainability was eroding. Victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram had destroyed old empires, but they had not created shared allegiance. Reforms imposed from Paris modernized states, yet they also displaced local authority. Nationalism, once fragmented under dynasties, hardened under occupation. What Napoleon viewed as rational reorganization, others experienced as foreign domination. The continental system epitomized this contradiction. Designed to weaken Britain, it bound Europe economically to France while impoverishing it in practice. Smuggling flourished, ports suffered, merchants rebelled quietly, allies complied reluctantly. Enforcement required annexation, coercion, and surveillance. Economic warfare became internal warfare, pitting empire against its own dependencies. Napoleon understood the danger, but believed momentum would prevail. He trusted his ability to resolve contradictions through decisive action. He had always believed that clarity emerged from confrontation. If resistance grew, it could be broken. If alliances frayed, they could be forced back into line. History, he believed, favored those who acted boldly rather than hesitated. Yet Europe was changing beneath his feet. Prussia reformed in silence. Britain financed resistance across the continent. Spain bled the empire through attrition. Russia drifted further from compliance. The empire still expanded, but its foundations weakened. Napoleon's victories had created expectations he could not escape. He had crowned himself through conquest. He had justified authority through dominance. Peace now threatened his legitimacy as much as defeat. Without movement, doubt would spread. Without war, the empire's purpose would falter. The paradox was complete. To preserve order, he needed expansion. To sustain expansion, he needed resources and loyalty. To secure loyalty, he needed peace. Each solution undermined the next. Napoleon stood at the apex of power and at the edge of decision. The system he had built was brilliant, disciplined, and vast. It was also inflexible. It required constant success. One failure could unravel years of conquest. One miscalculation could expose the limits of force. By 1811, Europe was no longer merely resisting Napoleon's rule. It was adapting to survive it. The emperor's enemies learned patience. They learned endurance. They learned how to wait for the moment when momentum would falter. Napoleon sensed this tightening circle. He did not retreat. He did not compromise. He prepared for confrontation. The pressure that had reshaped Europe now pressed inward, toward the core of his empire, toward the foundation of his authority. The question was no longer whether Napoleon could defeat his enemies. It was whether his empire could survive the weight of its own ambition. And as Europe strained under the burden of domination, Napoleon Bonaparte turned toward the east, toward a vast land that would test not only his armies, but the limits of conquest itself. The system had reached its breaking point. By 1812, the Napoleonic Empire had reached the outer edge of its own logic. Expansion had sustained authority. Victory had justified rule. But the system now demanded enforcement on a scale that tested even Napoleon's unmatched capacity for command. Europe was no longer simply governed. It was strained. And at the far eastern edge of the continent stood Russia, vast, resistant, and increasingly unwilling to submit. The alliance between France and Russia had always been fragile. Bound together after earlier defeats, Tsar Alexander I complied outwardly with Napoleon's continental system while quietly undermining it. Russian merchants relied on British trade, Russian nobles resented French dominance, and Russian pride, rooted in distance, faith, and empire, bristled under subordination. The illusion of cooperation masked a growing rupture. Napoleon interpreted this defiance as a challenge to the foundation of his rule. If Russia could defy the system, others would follow. Authority anchored in dominance could not tolerate selective obedience. The continental system, already straining Europe, depended on uniform enforcement. To allow Russia exemption would signal weakness, and weakness, Napoleon believed, was contagious. Thus, he chose war, not as a gamble, but as enforcement. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 men, drawn from across the empire and its satellites, French, German, Italian, Polish. Europe marched east under one banner. It was a demonstration of imperial reach as much as military power. Napoleon expected a familiar pattern. He anticipated decisive battle near the frontier, a crushing victory, a negotiated peace. He had broken Austria and Prussia this way. He believed Russia would yield once confronted with overwhelming force. Russia did not. As the Grande Armée advanced, the Russian armies withdrew, deliberately, relentlessly. Villages were abandoned, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. The land itself became an enemy. Napoleon pushed deeper, chasing a battle that refused to occur. Distance stretched supply lines, heat exhausted men, horses collapsed, discipline eroded. The campaign began to unravel before a major battle was fought. Napoleon entered a world that did not conform to his system. Russia was too vast to be compressed, too willing to sacrifice territory for time. Each mile gained brought no resolution, only emptiness. The deeper the army advanced, the weaker it became. When battle finally came at Borodino in September 1812, it was savage and indecisive. Tens of thousands fell in a single day. Napoleon technically held the field, but the Russian army was not destroyed. It withdrew again, intact enough to continue resistance. The road to Moscow lay open. Napoleon entered the city expecting capitulation. Instead, he found silence and flame. Moscow burned, abandoned by its people, stripped of resources, rendered useless as a prize. There would be no treaty, no surrender, only waiting. Napoleon lingered too long. He waited for diplomacy that never came, for order that never returned, for victory that no longer followed occupation. Autumn slipped into winter, supplies dwindled, morale collapsed. The army that had conquered Europe now stood trapped in a hostile void. And then came the cold. The retreat from Moscow began not as a maneuver, but as a necessity. Frost shattered cohesion, starvation spread, discipline disintegrated. Russian forces harried the columns relentlessly. What had begun as the most powerful army in history became a procession of survivors. The Grande Armée was destroyed, not by one battle, but by distance, weather, and miscalculation. This was more than defeat. It was revelation. For the first time, Napoleon's system failed catastrophically. War, once his instrument of control, now exposed the limits of ambition and planning. The illusion of invincibility cracked. Europe watched closely, and it understood. The retreat from Russia was not merely a military disaster, it was the beginning of collapse. The destruction of the Grande Armée did not end on the frozen roads west of Moscow. It echoed across Europe with terrifying clarity. News traveled faster than Napoleon's retreating columns. For the first time in over a decade, the emperor was not merely challenged, he was exposed. The myth of invincibility collapsed. As remnants of the army staggered back across the Niemen, allies reassessed their loyalty. States that had complied out of fear now sensed opportunity. Prussia, long humiliated and carefully reformed in silence, began to stir. Austria hesitated, measuring risk with renewed confidence. Russia, bloodied but unbroken, emerged not as a defeated adversary, but as a catalyst. Napoleon moved quickly, as he always had. He raised new armies with astonishing speed, drawing on France's still deep reserves of manpower and administrative efficiency. Boys replaced veterans, experience gave way to urgency. The emperor's energy remained formidable, but something fundamental had shifted: the quality of his force and the patience of Europe. In 1813, war returned to Central Europe on a scale even greater than before. At Lutzen and Bautzen, Napoleon still demonstrated tactical brilliance, driving back coalition forces and proving that his mind remained lethal. But these were victories without resolution. They lacked the decisiveness that had once ended wars swiftly. The enemy withdrew, regrouped, and returned stronger. The balance had changed. Coalition armies learned to avoid the decisive battle Napoleon sought. They coordinated across fronts, absorbed losses, and relied on overwhelming numbers. War became a contest of endurance rather than genius. For the first time, Napoleon faced opponents who refused to play by his rules. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, in October 1813. It was the largest conflict Europe had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands clashed over days of relentless combat. Napoleon fought with determination, but the tide was against him. Former allies turned against France mid-battle. Supply lines fractured. Retreat became inevitable. Leipzig was decisive. Napoleon's defeat shattered his control over Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed. France's satellite states defected. The empire unraveled faster than it had been built. What years of victory had assembled, months of failure dismantled. As coalition armies pressed westward, Napoleon's options narrowed. He fought brilliantly in defense of France during the campaign of 1814. outmaneuvering larger forces, winning tactical engagements that recalled his early genius. But brilliance could no longer compensate for exhaustion. France itself was tired. Conscription had drained families. Resources were depleted. Confidence was gone. Why? Paris fell. In April 1814, Napoleon abdicated the throne. The empire he had forged through conquest dissolved under the weight of coalition unity and internal fatigue. He was exiled to the island of Elba, a small, symbolic prison for a man who had once commanded a continent. The collapse was swift, but not sudden. It had been building since the moment Russia refused to yield. The invasion of 1812 marked the point where Napoleon's ambition exceeded the capacity of his system. He had tried to compress a land that could not be compressed, to enforce obedience where distance dissolved control. Russia had not defeated Napoleon through superior tactics. It had defeated him by refusing to conform. The retreat from Moscow had shown that power has limits, limits imposed not only by enemies, but by geography, climate, and human endurance. Napoleon's empire, designed for speed and dominance, could not survive prolonged resistance on that scale. The man who had mastered war now faced its consequences. And Europe, long reshaped by his will, moved quickly to erase his dominance before it could return. Exile did not bring closure. It brought reckoning. From the rocky shores of Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte watched the empire he had built dissolve into memory. Europe moved swiftly to restore balance. The Bourbons returned to the French throne. Borders were redrawn. Titles were reclaimed. The victors spoke of legitimacy, tradition, and stability, as if the previous 20 years had been an aberration rather than a transformation. But beneath this restoration lay fear. They had seen what Napoleon could do and what Europe could become under a single relentless will. Russia had broken his momentum, but it had not erased his impact. The collapse of his empire revealed not only the limits of power, but the cost of ignoring them. Napoleon understood this with painful clarity. The invasion of Russia had not failed because of cowardice or incompetence. It had failed because the assumptions that sustained his system no longer held. Speed could not conquer distance. Discipline could not command winter. Victory could not compel surrender when the enemy refused to value territory over survival. Dato, the retreat from Moscow, was the image that haunted his legacy. Columns of soldiers reduced to shadows, horses frozen in place, cannons abandoned in snow, an army once defined by motion now immobilized by nature. This was not defeat by genius, but defeat by reality. History had closed in not with drama, but with inevitability. The consequences were irreversible. Allies who had obeyed out of fear now rebelled. Enemies who had learned patience now coordinated. Napoleon's system, built on constant success, could not survive sustained failure. Authority evaporated as quickly as it had formed. Momentum, once lost, could not be reclaimed. Even his final campaigns in France, brilliant though they were, could not alter the trajectory. Tactical victories no longer translated into political survival. The nation he had ruled through motion now yearned for rest. France was no longer willing to pay the price of greatness. Napoleon's abdication was not merely the end of a reign. It was the end of an idea that one man's will, however brilliant, could indefinitely compress the complexity of Europe into order. Yet collapse did not mean erasure. The institutions Napoleon created endured. The laws he codified remained. The administrative state he built survived monarchs and republics alike. Even his enemies retained what worked. The modern world carried his imprint forward, quietly and permanently. Russia had destroyed his army. It had not destroyed his legacy. Napoleon's downfall revealed a truth as old as history itself. Power expands until it meets limits it cannot overcome. In seeking total enforcement, he exposed the boundary between control and overreach. The same clarity that once brought victory now delivered collapse. War, which had been his language of authority, became his undoing. The emperor who believed history rewarded strength had discovered that history also punishes excess. Ambition without restraint invites resistance. Systems built on momentum require infinite fuel, and no empire, however disciplined, can outrun geography, climate, and time forever. From Russia's frozen roads emerged the end of an age. The illusion of invincibility shattered. Europe reclaimed its agency, and Napoleon Bonaparte, once the architect of continental order, became a symbol of its limits. Thus ended the march of conquest, not with surrender alone, but with understanding. For in Russia, Napoleon did not merely lose an army. He lost the future he had tried to command. In the spring of 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped down from a throne he had seized by will and defended by war. The abdication was formal, restrained, and heavy with implication. Europe's armies occupied Paris. His marshals urged acceptance. France, drained by decades of mobilization, no longer resisted. The emperor who had once dictated the fate of nations now signed his own removal from power. He was granted sovereignty over a speck of land in the Mediterranean, Elba. The island was small, but the symbolism was vast. Reduced from continental master to island ruler, Napoleon entered exile with discipline intact and ambition unresolved. He governed Elba with the same energy he had applied to empires, reorganizing administration, improving roads, modernizing defenses. He was restless, observant, and acutely aware of Europe's fragility without him. Across the continent, restoration brought neither harmony nor confidence. The Bourbons returned to France promising stability, yet they struggled to reconcile revolution's legacy with monarchy's return. Veterans were sidelined, reforms were questioned. The army, once the spine of national identity, felt humiliated. Napoleon followed these developments closely, reading reports, measuring sentiment, and recognizing a familiar pattern: legitimacy eroding through miscalculation. Exile sharpened his instincts. He understood that his authority had not vanished, it had been displaced. His legend persisted among soldiers, citizens, and officers who remembered order delivered through strength. Europe's rulers feared this memory. They underestimated its pull. In February 1815, Napoleon acted. He escaped Elba with a small force and landed on the French coast. What followed was not a campaign, but a phenomenon. Troops sent to arrest him joined him instead. Cities opened their gates. The king fled. Without firing a shot, Napoleon reclaimed France. The 100 Days began. Napoleon returned not as a conqueror, but as a man racing against time. Europe responded instantly. Coalitions reformed with clarity born of experience. This time, there would be no negotiation, no hesitation. Napoleon understood the stakes. One victory could restore his position. One defeat would end it forever. He moved to strike before enemies could fully assemble. In June 1815, near the village of Waterloo, Napoleon faced coalition forces led by Britain and Prussia. The battle unfolded under heavy rain and heavy expectation. Napoleon fought with determination, deploying skill refined over decades. But circumstances turned against him: weather, delays, misjudgments, and the arrival of Prussian reinforcements at a critical moment. By nightfall, the outcome was clear. Waterloo was decisive. The defeat ended not only the 100 Days, but the Napoleonic era itself. There would be no second restoration, no negotiated settlement. Europe had resolved the question of Napoleon Bonaparte permanently. He surrendered to the British and was sent far from the continent, to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. There would be no return from there. St. Helena was exile without illusion. Isolated by ocean, distant from politics, and stripped of authority, Napoleon confronted a reality he had avoided all his life: stillness. The island's winds were relentless, its landscape unforgiving, its isolation complete. He lived under constant surveillance, his movements restricted, his communications monitored. The man who had once moved armies across continents now measured time in days and memory. Yet even here, Napoleon remained active. He dictated memoirs, recounted campaigns, and shaped his own narrative with deliberate precision. He explained decisions, justified ambition, and framed defeats as products of circumstance rather than flaw. History, he believed, was a battlefield like any other, one that could still be contested through words. In exile, Napoleon became both subject and author. He reflected on his rise from obscurity, his mastery of war, his transformation of France. He spoke of law, merit, and order with the same conviction that had driven his reforms. He acknowledged errors, but rarely limits. Russia, he conceded, had been catastrophic, but catastrophe, he argued, did not negate purpose. His health declined steadily. Years of exertion, stress, and confinement took their toll. Isolation weighed heavily. The empire faded into recollection. Europe moved on. Yet Napoleon's mind remained engaged, sharp, and resolute. He knew he would not return, but he also knew he would not be forgotten. In May 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. At Daton, the news traveled slowly, but its resonance was immediate. Europe paused, not in mourning, but in recognition. The man who had reshaped borders, institutions, and expectations had finally exited history's stage. What remained was judgment. That judgment was divided. To some, Napoleon was a tyrant, an insatiable warmonger who sacrificed millions for personal glory. To others, he was a reformer who carried the revolution's promise farther than any assembly ever could. He destroyed feudal privilege, codified equality before the law, and built states that could function beyond tradition. Both interpretations were true. Napoleon had modernized Europe through conquest. He had spread law through war. He had unified systems by force. His legacy was not clean. It was complex, contradictory, and enduring. France retained his legal codes. Europe retained his administrative models. Nations retained the memory of resistance he had provoked and the nationalism he had unintentionally awakened. Napoleon had tried to impose order upon history. History responded by absorbing him into its lessons. Napoleon Bonaparte's true legacy cannot be measured solely in victories or defeats. It must be traced through institutions, ideas, and the modern world that followed him. Empires rose and fell long before Napoleon, but few men left such a durable imprint on how power is organized and justified. He transformed law into an instrument of equality and control. The Napoleonic Code institutionalized merit, property rights, and secular authority, replacing feudal chaos with rational structure. It outlived him because it answered a fundamental need: predictability. Even regimes that despised Napoleon preserved his laws because they worked. He reshaped the relationship between state and citizen. Under Napoleon, the modern administrative state took form: centralized, professional, and efficient. Authority flowed through institutions rather than lineage. Careers opened to talent. Education served national purpose. These structures became the blueprint for governance across Europe. Yet his legacy also carries a warning. Napoleon proved that brilliance without restraint invites collapse. His system depended on constant success. His legitimacy depended on motion. When expansion met limits, geography, climate, human endurance, the structure failed. Power concentrated too tightly leaves no margin for error. Napoleon unleashed forces he could not fully control. Nationalism, awakened in resistance to French domination, reshaped Europe long after his fall. Wars of liberation followed wars of conquest. Borders hardened, identities deepened. The continent he tried to unify by force emerged more fragmented, but more self-aware. In this sense, Napoleon was both creator and catalyst. He accelerated history. He compressed centuries of change into decades. He forced Europe to confront modernity, often violently, always decisively. His life stands as paradox. A man who rose by merit crowned himself emperor, a reformer who depended on war, a stabilizer who required perpetual motion. Napoleon believed history rewarded strength. History did, but it also demanded restraint. His story endures because it mirrors a timeless truth, that human ambition can reshape the world but never escape its limits, that order imposed without consent breeds resistance, that brilliance, unbalanced by humility, carries the seed of its own undoing. Napoleon Bonaparte did not simply live in history. He transformed it and was transformed by it. From exile and return, from law and war, from triumph and collapse, his shadow still stretches across the modern world, unfinished, instructive, and impossible to ignore. And in that shadow, history offers its final lesson. Greatness endures only when power remembers its limits. From cannon smoke to codes of law, his shadow still walks beside modern history, unfinished, instructive, and impossible to ignore.